Hello friend, welcome to Sleepy Old World. Get comfortable. Before we go anywhere tonight, if these stories have been keeping you company, a like genuinely helps more than you would probably guess. And if you want more nights like this, one waiting for you whenever you need them, subscribing costs nothing and means a great deal to me. That is the whole pitch, and I promise I will not bring it up again tonight. What I would truly love to know is where you are listening from right now. Maybe you are somewhere in Phoenix tonight, the air conditioner working hard against a heat that has not really let go, even now, well after dark. Maybe you're in Houston, a box fan turned up high in the corner, pushing around air that is still thick and warm at this hour. Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one of them, always. All right, love. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest. Let us go. Tonight, we're going all the way back to the 1880s to talk about what ordinary life in America was really like, and I promise you, some of what is coming is going to genuinely shock you. And we are not beginning with the part everyone already pictures, not the wars, not the politicians, not the robber barons in their marble halls, because that is a version of this era you have already seen 100 times without me. The real America, the one where most people actually lived. It is not yet 5 a.m, and somewhere out in Ohio a woman is already awake in the dark. Maybe she is 26 years old, with 2 children asleep in the next room and a third on the way, though she has not told anyone yet, not even her husband, because there is a particular kind of quiet a woman keeps around a thing like that until she is sure of it. Maybe she's older, closer to 40, with grown daughters who have already married off the farm and moved to town, and she lies there for 1 extra minute in the dark listening to a house that has gotten strangely quiet since they left. Maybe she is neither of these women exactly, but some version close enough that you recognize her anyway. The particular ache in the shoulders that comes from a life spent lifting, the way she is already, before her feet even touch the floor, running through the list of what the day will require of her, a list she could probably recite in her sleep by now, and very nearly does. Here is the thing nobody tells you about 1880s America. It was not, for most people, a world of hoop skirts and parlour pianos and dinner parties. That was a version of the era reserved for a very small number of very fortunate households. The kind you see in the photographs that made it into the history books because someone had the money to hire a photographer. For the overwhelming majority of Americans, life in this decade was physical in a way that is almost impossible to fully imagine now. From inside a world of running water and electric light and food that arrives already clean and already cut, it was a life measured in buckets carried and fires built and hours spent on your knees. And it was, in its own strange way, also a life full of warmth and stubbornness and a kind of quiet resilience that I find myself genuinely admiring the more I read about it. The woman we are with tonight, let us call her Margaret, though of course that is not her real name. She is a composite, built from the diaries and letters and household ledgers that ordinary women actually left behind. Margaret rises in darkness, because the fire has to be started before anything else in the house can happen. Not a fire for warmth, particularly, though in winter that matters too, but a fire in the cookstove, the great black iron beast that dominates the kitchen, and that will, if she tends it correctly, cook every meal her family eats today. She has laid the kindling the night before, a habit her own mother beat into her before she was 10 years old, because there is nothing worse than fumbling for kindling with cold hands in the dark while a baby cries somewhere behind you. A friction match is a small miracle she does not think about. A friction match, still a relatively recent convenience by the standards of her grandmother's generation, who had to keep coals banked overnight, or borrow fire from a neighbour if the hearth went cold. Margaret strikes it against the rough strip on the box, and there is that particular smell, sulphur and phosphorus, sharp and a little unpleasant, that will become one of the defining smells of her entire life without her ever noticing it as anything unusual. The kindling catches. She feeds it slowly, the way you learn to after burning your fingers enough times, and within a few minutes there is real fire, and she can begin closing the stove's iron doors and adjusting the dampers, that particular clank and scrape of iron on iron that will happen in this kitchen, and 100,000 kitchens like it, every single morning for years, While the stove heats, there is water to fetch. And this is the part of the morning that modern people find hardest to picture, because water in the 1880s does not simply arrive. It has to be gone and gotten. If Margaret is lucky, and luck here means her husband dug the well close to the house, instead of clear across the yard, she has perhaps 40 steps to walk, empty buckets swinging, and 40 steps back with it full and heavy enough to pull at her shoulder in a way that, over years, will genuinely change the shape of her body. If she's not so lucky, the well or the creek might be considerably farther, and the walk becomes something she does 4, 5, 6 times before breakfast is even finished, because water is needed for coffee, for washing faces, for the animals, for the dishes that will pile up before noon. The pump handle, if she has one instead of a rope and bucket over open water, has its own particular resistance, a stiffness in the cold months that makes her brace her whole body against it, and there is a sound to it too, a wet, sucking groan before the water finally comes that she could probably identify blindfolded even now, decades later, if you played it back to her. By the time the water is in, the fire is properly going, and this is when the house starts to wake up around her. Not all at once. Her husband first, most likely, a man we might call Thomas, though again, he's drawn from many men rather than one particular soul, and Thomas swings his legs out of bed with the particular groan of someone whose body already knows, before his mind has fully caught up, exactly how much labour the day ahead is going to demand of it. If this is a farm, and for roughly 7 out of every 10 American families in this decade it is, then Thomas has animals waiting on him before he has so much as looked at a cup of coffee. Cows do not care that it is dark and cold. They need milking whether the sun has bothered to rise yet or not. There is something almost tender in the way these routines lock together, his labour and hers, without either of them needing to discuss it. The way you might set 2 gears meshing without either one ever explicitly agreeing to the arrangement. He is out the door toward the barn before she has the coffee properly boiling, and by the time he comes back in, hands red from cold water and rough rope, stamping frost or mud off his boots at the door, she will have something hot ready, because that particular exchange, warmth for labour, labour for warmth, is one of the quiet contracts that holds this whole world together. The children wake next, and here is where I want to pause for a moment, because the 1880s had a relationship to childhood that is going to sound almost unbelievable to modern ears. A child of 6 in this household is not, generally speaking, considered too young for real work. Not brutal work, not the kind that would have alarmed even the standards of the time, but real, useful, expected labour. A 6-year-old might be responsible for gathering eggs, for fetching kindling, for watching a baby sibling while the mother's hands are occupied elsewhere. By 8 or 9, that same child might be milking a goat, feeding chickens, hauling smaller loads of water, and by 12, in many households, a child's labour was genuinely, arithmetically necessary to the family's survival. Not a character-building exercise, but an economic fact. I want to be honest with you about something here, because it would be easy to make this sound grim in a way that misses the texture of how it actually felt from the inside. These children were not, by and large, miserable about it, or at least not constantly so in the way we might assume looking backward with modern eyes. Work was simply what a body did. The same way eating was what a body did, and a child's sense of usefulness, of being genuinely needed by a family that depended on them, carried its own kind of dignity that is honestly a little harder to come by for children today, who are often, with the best intentions in the world, protected from ever feeling truly necessary to anything. That said, and this is the part that does genuinely unsettle me, the line between expected labour and outright exploitation was thinner than most people realise, and it did not always hold. In the growing industrial cities, children as young as 7 or 8 were working in textile mills, 12-hour shifts standing at machines that could, and sometimes did take fingers, occasionally worse. This was not universal, and reformers were already, by the 1880s, beginning to push back against the worst of it. but child labour laws as anything resembling what we would recognise today simply did not exist yet in most states. A family desperate enough, and many were, would send a child to the mill floor rather than watch the whole household go hungry. Back on the farm, though, in Margaret's kitchen, the morning proceeds at its own particular rhythm. Breakfast, in most ordinary American households of this era, was not the light affair we might imagine today. It was, if anything, the largest meal some families ate, because the labour ahead demanded fuel the body could actually run on. Cornmeal mush, or if the family was slightly better off, biscuits made with lard and buttermilk, salt pork fried in its own fat, coffee that was, by any modern standard, genuinely terrible, often stretched with chicory or even roasted grain when the real thing was too dear, and eggs if the hens were laying, which in winter they mostly were not. Chickens being seasonal creatures whose habits the whole household had learned to work around. There is a detail here that I think about more than I probably should, which is how differently regions and classes ate this same meal. In the rural South, particularly among poorer white and black families alike, the classic breakfast was built around corn in nearly every form it could take: grits, mush, cornbread, hoe cakes cooked directly on a hot griddle, or even a hoe blade held over the fire, which is genuinely where the name comes from, not the sweet yellow corn on the cob that fills farmers' markets today. Field corn, dried and ground, coarse and filling and cheap, the kind of food that keeps a body working through a long day but does not particularly excite the tongue. In the urban northeast, among the growing immigrant populations pouring into cities like New York and Boston, breakfast might look entirely different depending on which boat your family had come over on. Italian households might have bread and perhaps a little cheese if they could afford it. German immigrant families, and there were enormous numbers of them settling particularly through the Midwest, brought with them a taste for dense, dark bread, and, where they could manage it, sausage. Irish families, many of whom had arrived a generation earlier fleeing the famine and were now raising American-born children, often kept a fondness for potatoes prepared any which way, fried, boiled, mashed into whatever else was available. And here is a detail that genuinely stops people cold every time I mention it. In many of these households, coffee was given to children, and not in small ceremonial sips either. A child of 5 or 6 might be handed a cup with real coffee in it, sometimes cut with milk and sugar, sometimes not, because the idea that caffeine was inappropriate for children simply had not caught on yet as a cultural concern. Doctors of the period had opinions about it certainly, and some cautioned against it, but plenty of ordinary families simply did what their own parents had done, and their parents before them, and coffee was, in the mind of most 19th century Americans, less a stimulant to be regulated and more a simple fact of the table, like salt. While breakfast is cooking, Margaret is doing at least 3 other things simultaneously, because this is a skill that 19th century domestic life demanded of women in a way that is genuinely hard to overstate. She might be nursing the youngest child at her breast while stirring the mush with her free hand. The baby's weight settled against her hip in a sling of cloth she has learned to tie one-handed, while also keeping half an ear on the older children, who are dressing themselves in clothes that were, more likely than not, sewn by her own hands from fabric she wove or bought by the yard, and cut according to a paper pattern she traced and retraced until the shapes were memorized. Clothing itself deserves a slower look here, because the sheer labour embedded in what people wore in this decade is almost impossible to appreciate from inside a world of ready-made garments and washing machines. For a woman like Margaret, a single dress might represent 20 or 30 hours of cutting and stitching, done by hand or, if the family was fortunate enough to own one, on a treadle sewing machine, which by the 1880s had become common enough in middle-class and even many working-class homes to be considered a genuinely significant household object, one that changed things enormously for whoever owned it. The sewing machine itself is worth pausing on. Powered entirely by the rhythmic pumping of a foot treadle, no electricity involved at all, it let a skilled operator complete in an hour what might have taken a full day by hand. Singer and other manufacturers had begun selling these machines on installment plans, specifically targeted at ordinary households, understanding correctly that a woman's labour, freed up even partially from constant hand sewing, was worth paying for over time. Many families considered the sewing machine, once they had saved or financed their way to one, among the most valuable objects in the entire house, more practically useful, day to day, than almost anything else they owned. Underneath whatever dress a woman wore, there was the corset, and here I want to slow down, because the popular image of the corset, the cartoonish tiny waist, the fainting Victorian lady, is not entirely accurate for how most ordinary women actually experience the garment. Yes, corsets shaped the torso, and yes, some women, particularly among the wealthy who could afford to prioritize fashion over function, laced tightly enough to genuinely restrict breathing and digestion. But for a working farm wife, a corset was more often laced for support than for extreme shaping, something closer to what we might now think of as structural undergarment, helping to bear the weight of heavy skirts and to support the back through a day of bending and lifting. Whalebone, or, increasingly by this decade, steel boning, gave the garment its structure, and a woman put hers on every single morning of her adult life, the way you might put on any other piece of clothing, without much more thought than that. There is a strange paradox sitting right in the middle of this that I find genuinely worth noticing. The corset, an object now remembered almost entirely as a symbol of restriction and even oppression, was for many ordinary women simply a tool, no more loaded with meaning than a good pair of work boots would be to a modern labourer. The meaning we have loaded onto it came later, from a different set of eyes looking backward. Underneath that again came the camise, a simple loose garment of cotton or linen, meant to protect the corset and outer clothing from the body's own sweat and oils, since laundering the heavy outer garments was such an enormous undertaking that anything that could reduce how often it needed doing was genuinely valuable. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it reframes the entire logic of 19th century dressing. People were not layering clothes for warmth or fashion alone. They were layering clothes specifically to manage the problem of cleanliness in a world where cleaning anything was hard, physical, time-consuming labor, which brings us naturally to washing day. And if there is one single ritual that defined the rhythm of the entire week for an ordinary American household in the 1880s, it was this one. Monday, almost universally, across regions and classes and backgrounds, was wash day. The reason for Monday specifically is a small mystery of its own, though the leading explanation is simply that Sunday was for church and rest, and by Monday the household's dirty linens had accumulated enough over the week that further delay became impractical. Whatever the reason, the pattern held with remarkable consistency across the entire country. Washing clothes in this decade meant, for most households, an enormous physical undertaking that began before dawn and often did not end until well after dark. Water first, of course, gallons and gallons of it, hauled and heated over the fire in a great iron kettle or copper boiler, because hot water was essential to actually cutting through the grease and dirt embedded in clothes worn for a full week of hard physical labor. Soap, in many rural households, was still made at home, a genuinely unpleasant process involving rendered animal fat and lye, the lye itself derived from wood ash that had been carefully leached with water through a barrel with holes in the bottom, a process passed down through generations of women who had learnt it from their mothers before them. The washing itself was done by hand, scrubbing garments against a ridged washboard until knuckles were raw, and this is not an exaggeration for effect. Women's hands in this era genuinely showed the physical toll of this labor, roughened and reddened in a way that a modern hand almost never is. The heaviest items, sheets and men's work trousers thick with dried mud and sweat, might need to be boiled first in the great kettle, stirred with a long wooden paddle called a battling stick, before ever reaching the washboard at all. And then, after the scrubbing, came the wringing, done entirely by hand until the wringer washer, a device with two rollers you cranked clothes through to squeeze out water, began appearing in more prosperous households toward the latter part of the decade, though it remained a genuine luxury for most. Then hanging, then, depending on the weather, waiting, sometimes anxiously, for garments to dry before the next round of dirty laundry demanded the line be cleared. A rainy Monday was a genuine household crisis in a way that is almost impossible to convey to someone who has never lived without a machine that dries clothes regardless of what the sky is doing outside. By the time washing was done, a woman's back and shoulders and hands ached in a specific familiar way, and Tuesday, not coincidentally, became ironing day in most households because the clothes needed to actually dry before they could be pressed. The iron itself, a heavy slab of solid metal heated directly on the stove, had to be tested constantly. A wet finger touched briefly to its surface to gauge the temperature. Too hot and it would scorch fabric that had taken hours to wash. Too cool and it would not press out the wrinkles at all. Women kept several irons heating at once, swapping a cooling one for a hot one in a continuous rotation that demanded its own kind of physical rhythm, back and forth to the stove, back and forth to the ironing board, for hours. I find myself genuinely struck, thinking about all this, by how much of a woman's entire week was organized around the basic physical maintenance of the household's cloth: washing, drying, ironing, mending, and then, inevitably, sewing new garments to replace what had finally worn past the point of repair. It was not a task among many. For a great many women, it was closer to a second full-time occupation layered directly on top of the first one, which was everything else. Now let us talk about something that tends to genuinely surprise people, which is bathing, or rather, how infrequently it actually happened. The idea of a daily bath, so basic to modern life that most of us never think about it at all, would have struck an ordinary 1880s American as strange, wasteful, and honestly a little suspicious. Water was too much labor to heat and haul for something to be done every day. Most households, even reasonably prosperous ones, managed a full bath perhaps once a week, often on Saturday night in preparation for church the following morning, and the process itself involved the entire family sharing the same water, one after another, in order of who was considered to need it least dirty, which usually meant the youngest children went first, and the men, coming in from the heaviest outdoor labor, went last. This is where that old expression about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater actually comes from, or at least this is the story that has attached itself to the phrase, whether entirely accurate or not, and I think it is worth sitting with regardless, because it tells you something true even if the etymology itself is debated. By the time the water had been used by 6 or 7 family members in succession, it had gone from clear to genuinely murky, and a small child bathed last or near last in that sequence could, in theory, become difficult to see clearly in the grey water. Between these weekly full baths, personal hygiene was managed through what people at the time called a sponge bath or a basin wash, a much smaller undertaking involving a bowl of water, a washcloth, and attention paid mainly to the face, hands, underarms, and other areas considered to need daily attention. This was done standing at a washstand in the bedroom, usually first thing in the morning, the water often left over from the previous evening, or freshly poured from a pitcher kept for exactly this purpose. Since we are on the subject, body odor in this era was simply a more constant fact of daily life than most modern people can easily imagine, managed as best it could be through the layering of clothing that absorbed sweat, through the reliance on herbs and simple perfumes among those who could afford them, and through a cultural tolerance for it that we have almost entirely lost. Dental care in the 1880s is frankly the detail that tends to disturb people most when I describe it honestly. Toothbrushes existed, generally made with a bone or wooden handle and bristles from hog hair, and tooth powder, a gritty paste often made from a combination of chalk, salt, and sometimes charcoal, was available for those who used it at all. But daily brushing was far from a universal habit, particularly in poorer or more rural households, where it simply was not part of the inherited routine passed down through the family. Baking soda mixed with a little salt was a common homemade alternative, and some families used nothing at all beyond rinsing the mouth with water. The consequences of this were, to put it plainly, brutal. Tooth decay was rampant across every class of American society, though it hit poorer families hardest, since dental care beyond basic hygiene was expensive and often simply unavailable outside of larger towns and cities. When a tooth became infected or painful beyond bearing, the standard treatment was extraction, performed by a dentist if one was accessible and affordable, or, in many rural areas, by a doctor, a barber, or sometimes simply a neighbor known to have a steady hand and a pair of pliers. Anesthesia in the form of ether, or, increasingly by this decade, cocaine solutions applied directly to the gums, was available in more urban practices, but plenty of extractions in rural America still happened with nothing more than whiskey and a strong grip from whoever was holding the patient still. I want to pause here on something that genuinely stays with me every time I think about it, which is how normal chronic pain was as a simple background condition of adult life in this era. Toothaches that would send a modern person to an emergency room were, for many 19th century Americans, something you simply lived with for weeks or months, managed with whiskey, with clove oil dabbed directly onto the aching tooth, with whatever folk remedy your particular family or region favoured, until the pain became genuinely unbearable and extraction, with all its own brutality, became the lesser evil. This brings us naturally to medicine more broadly, and here the 1880s sits at a genuinely strange hinge point in history, caught between old folk knowledge passed down through generations and the first stirrings of what would eventually become modern scientific medicine. Louis Pasteur's germ theory had been gaining acceptance among trained physicians through the 1870s and 80s, but this understanding had not yet fully trickled down into ordinary household practice, and most Americans, even educated ones, still held a mix of beliefs about illness that would strike a modern doctor as a peculiar blend of insight and superstition. A woman like Margaret, faced with a sick child, would reach first for the remedies her own mother had taught her, long before ever considering the expense and inconvenience of summoning a doctor, who in rural areas might be many miles away and difficult to reach quickly regardless of the weather. For a fever, she might reach for willow bark tea, which, interestingly enough, actually contains a compound chemically related to what would eventually become aspirin, meaning some of this folk medicine genuinely worked, even if nobody involved understood exactly why. For a cough, perhaps a poultice of mustard seed mixed into a paste and applied directly to the chest, hot enough to genuinely burn the skin if left too long, intended to draw out whatever internal congestion was believed to be causing the trouble. For croup, a frightening and genuinely dangerous condition in small children that causes a distinctive barking cough and difficulty breathing, home remedies ranged from the reasonably sensible steam from a boiling kettle held near the child's face to ease breathing, to the frankly bizarre, including the once common practice of hanging a bag of asafoetida, a pungent resin with a smell some compared to rotting garlic, around a child's neck to ward off illness through its odor alone. I mention this one specifically because it genuinely stops people cold when I describe it. Entire generations of American children walked around smelling faintly of what many people described as sulfur and spoiled onions, all in the sincere and completely unfounded belief that the smell itself kept sickness at bay. Patent medicines deserve their own mention here, because this decade saw an explosion of bottled remedies sold door to door, through mail-order catalogs, and in general stores across the country, promising to cure everything from consumption to female complaints to simple tiredness. And here is the detail that tends to genuinely shock people. A great many of these patent medicines contain substantial amounts of alcohol, sometimes as much as 40% by volume, along with, in a disturbing number of cases, opium, morphine or cocaine, entirely unregulated and often not even disclosed on the label. Mothers dosed fussy infants with soothing syrups that were, in plain terms, opiate solutions, entirely legal, widely advertised, and genuinely capable of quieting a crying baby, for reasons that, with hindsight, are deeply unsettling. I do not say any of this to be alarming for its own sake. I say it because I think it is genuinely important to understand how differently this era thought about the body, about pain, about what was considered an acceptable risk in pursuit of relief. These were not careless people. They were people doing their absolute best with the knowledge available to them, in a world where a trip to a doctor was expensive, distant, and often not meaningfully more scientific than what grandmother already knew. There is one more piece of the hygiene picture worth mentioning before we move on, and it is the outhouse, that small, usually unheated wooden structure standing some distance from the main house, which served as the bathroom for the vast majority of Americans in this decade, urban and rural alike, though city dwellers were beginning, by the 1880s, to see the first spread of indoor plumbing in wealthier neighborhoods. For everyone else, the outhouse was simply a fact of daily life, visited in the dark of early morning, in the heat of summer with its particular accompanying smell and the flies that came with it, and in the genuine misery of winter, when a trip to the outhouse in below freezing temperatures was something you learnt to accomplish as quickly as humanly possible. Inside the house, particularly at night or during the worst of winter weather, the chamber pot served the same purpose. A covered ceramic or enamel container kept beneath the bed, emptied each morning in a task that fell, almost without exception, to the woman of the house, or, in households wealthy enough to afford one, a servant. Old newspapers, or, for those who could not afford even that, corn cobs, served the function that we now assign to a product so basic we rarely think about it at all. I mention this specific detail not to dwell on it, but because it genuinely illustrates something important about the era, which is how much of ordinary daily life was organized around problems that have simply vanished from modern experience, absorbed so completely into infrastructure we never see that we forget they were ever problems at all. Now let us step outside into the fields, because if we are talking about ordinary life in the 1880s, we cannot spend all our time indoors. This was still, fundamentally, an agricultural nation. Roughly 70% of Americans lived in rural areas, and farming, in one form or another, touched the daily rhythm of the majority of American households. Whether they owned their land outright, worked it as tenants, or labored for wages on someone else's acreage, a man like Thomas, our composite farmer, rose before the sun, as we have already seen, and his day from that point forward was dictated almost entirely by season, weather, and particular demands of whatever crop his region and soil favored. In the Midwest, this likely meant corn and wheat, planted in spring with methods that by the 1880s were beginning to shift from purely manual labor toward mechanized assistance, though the transition was far from complete. The McCormick reaper, patented decades earlier but continuously improved and increasingly affordable through this period, had already begun to change what a single farmer and a team of horses could accomplish in a day, cutting grain that would once have required a crew of men wielding scythes. But mechanization, where it existed at all, existed unevenly, and plenty of farms, particularly smaller ones, or those in regions where capital was scarce, still relied heavily on hand labor and horse or mule power for nearly everything. Plowing meant walking behind a horse-drawn plow for hours, the reins looped around your shoulders, guiding the blade through soil that fought you the entire way, particularly in the heavy clay soils common through parts of the Midwest and South. This was not a task you finished in an afternoon. A single field might take days, walking miles back and forth across ground that never seemed to end, and by evening a farmer's legs and lower back carried an ache that had genuinely become a permanent condition of his adult life, the same way Margaret's hands carried the permanent roughness of years spent at the washboard. In the South, cotton dominated the agricultural landscape in a way that shaped nearly everything about daily life for millions of Americans, both black and white, though under circumstances that differed enormously depending on race and economic position. This was, it is important to say plainly, only about 2 decades removed from the end of slavery, and the system that had replaced it for the majority of formerly enslaved black families, sharecropping, carried its own brutal logic. A black family, often working land they did not own and never realistically would, gave a substantial portion of their crop, sometimes half or more, to the landowner in exchange for the right to farm it, along with credit at a company store that frequently trapped families in cycles of debt that could last generations, since the prices charged were often inflated well beyond what the same goods would cost in cash elsewhere. I think it is important, when we talk about ordinary daily life in this era, that we do not smooth over this particular reality in pursuit of a cozier picture. For a great many black families in the rural South during the 1880s, daily life meant genuine, grinding poverty, compounded by a legal and social system actively designed to limit their opportunities and their freedom of movement, even as they worked land from dawn until dark, with a dedication and skill that the system around them refused to properly compensate. And yet, and this is the part that genuinely moves me every time I encounter it in the letters and records that survive, these families built churches and schools where none had existed, and mutual aid societies, and a rich, resilient culture of music and community and faith that carried forward through circumstances that would have broken something in a less determined people. For white tenant farmers and small landowners in the same region, life was hard in different ways. still bound to the volatile price of cotton on a national market they had no control over, still vulnerable to a single bad harvest wiping out a year's labor entirely, but without the additional weight of the racial caste system that governed every aspect of a black family's daily existence, from where they could shop, to how they were addressed by white neighbors, to whether they could realistically expect fair treatment in a courtroom. Further west, in the Plains states being rapidly settled through this decade, an entirely different kind of farming life was taking shape. Homesteaders, drawn by the promise of the Homestead Act, which offered 160 acres of land to anyone willing to live on it and improve it for 5 years, faced a landscape almost entirely without trees, which meant no readily available timber for building. The solution that emerged, and this genuinely surprises people every time I mention it, was sod, cut directly from the thick prairie grass root systems and stacked like enormous heavy bricks into walls a foot or more thick. A sod house, or soddy as settlers commonly called it, was dark, prone to leaking mud through the ceiling during heavy rain, and home to an entire ecosystem of insects and the occasional snake that had simply never left when the walls went up around it. But it was also genuinely warm in winter and cool in summer, better insulated in many ways than the wood frame houses that would eventually replace it once rail lines made lumber more accessible. Now let us leave the farm behind for a while and walk into a city, because by the 1880s, American cities were swelling with an entirely different kind of ordinary life, one shaped less by soil and season, and more by the whistle of a factory clock. Maybe this is a different woman entirely, someone we might call Anna, 22 years old, having arrived in New York or Chicago or Pittsburgh perhaps 3 years earlier on a ship crowded with more people than she had ever seen in one place in her life. Maybe her family came from Germany or Ireland, or increasingly by this decade, from Eastern Europe and Italy, part of the great waves of immigration that were fundamentally reshaping the ethnic makeup of American cities in ways that would have been unrecognizable to an American of even one generation earlier. Maybe Anna works in a garment factory, one of thousands of young women doing exactly this same work across dozens of cities, and her day begins, like Margaret's, before the sun, though for entirely different reasons. A factory whistle, not a rooster or the internal clock of habit, dictates the beginning of Anna's day, and it is unforgiving in a way that farm labor, for all its own brutality, generally was not. Farm work bent, at least somewhat, to weather and season and the particular judgment of the person doing it. Factory work bent to nothing. The whistle blew at a fixed hour, and a worker who arrived late, even by a few minutes, might find a portion of her wages docked, or in some workplaces, simply find herself replaced entirely, since there were, in most industrial cities of this era, more workers desperate for employment than there were positions available. The workday itself commonly ran 10 to 12 hours, 6 days a week, standing for the entire duration at a machine or workbench, in rooms that were, depending on the season, either stifling from poor ventilation and the heat generated by dozens of machines running simultaneously, or bitterly cold, since heating an entire factory floor for the comfort of the workers was rarely a priority for owners focused on production costs. The air itself, in a textile mill particularly, was thick with lint and dust that workers breathed for their entire shift, a condition that contributed over years to genuine respiratory illness that nobody at the time fully connected to the workplace itself. Wages for a young woman like Anna might amount to somewhere between $4 and $6 for a full week of this labor, depending on the industry, the city, and her particular skill level, a sum that sounds almost meaningless, stated plainly like that. So let me put it in context. Rent for a single room in a crowded tenement building, shared with several family members or, in some cases, unrelated boarders taken in to help cover costs, might run $1 or $2 per week. Food, if managed with real care and no waste whatsoever, might be stretched to fit within another $2 or $3. What remained, if anything did, was the entire margin between survival and genuine hardship, and there was very little room in that margin for illness, for a slow season at the factory, or for any of the small emergencies that ordinary life inevitably produces. I want to slow down here on tenement housing specifically, because it is genuinely one of the starkest contrasts between rural and urban ordinary life in this decade. In cities like New York, entire families, sometimes 6 or 7 people, lived in 2 or 3 rooms within a building that might house dozens of similar families stacked on top of each other, sharing a single water pump or privy in the courtyard below among perhaps 100 other residents. Windows, where they existed at all in interior rooms, often opened not onto open air but onto narrow air shafts between buildings, admitting barely any natural light and even less genuine ventilation. The smell of these buildings, a combination of cooking food from dozens of different kitchens, coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and the particular mustiness of overcrowded, poorly ventilated space, was something that residents of these neighborhoods eventually stopped consciously noticing, the way you stop noticing any smell you live inside long enough. And yet, even here, even inside genuine hardship, there was a version of daily life that included real warmth and real community. Tenement buildings, for all their physical misery, often developed an intense, almost familial closeness among neighbors, particularly among immigrants from the same region or country, who might share childcare duties, trade food, celebrate holidays and religious observances together in the narrow hallways and courtyards that served as the only available gathering space. A mother running to a factory shift might leave her youngest children with a neighbor for a few coins, or simply on the understanding that the favor would be returned when needed, an informal but genuinely reliable safety net woven out of necessity and quite often real affection. Domestic service represented another enormous category of women's work in this era, and it deserves its own attention, because by the 1880s, a substantial percentage of American households wealthy enough to afford it employed at least one domestic servant, most commonly a young, unmarried woman who lived within the household itself. For many young women, particularly recent immigrants or those from rural areas seeking work in the city, domestic service offered something factory work did not, namely room and board included as part of the arrangement, along with wages that, while modest, did not need to be spent immediately on rent and food. The work itself was relentless in its own particular way, beginning before the family she served had woken, and often not ending until well after they had gone to bed. A domestic servant, depending on the size and wealth of the household, might be responsible for everything from cooking to cleaning to laundry to childcare, frequently all of it simultaneously, with perhaps a single afternoon off per week if her employer was generous, and considerably less if not. The relationship between servant and employer carried its own complicated intimacy, a young woman often knowing the most private details of a family's daily life, their arguments, their finances, their small vanities and habits, while remaining, in the social hierarchy of the household, fundamentally invisible, expected to move through rooms without drawing attention to herself, to speak only when spoken to disappear, essentially, into the function she performed. Let us return to childhood for a while, because there is so much more here worth sitting with, and it touches nearly every family in this era, rural and urban, wealthy and poor alike, in ways that shaped an entire generation of Americans. Birth itself, to begin at the very beginning, was an event that happened almost exclusively at home, attended not by a doctor in the majority of cases, but by a midwife, a woman, often older, who had learnt the practice through apprenticeship and years of hands-on experience, rather than any formal medical education. In rural areas particularly, a midwife might be summoned from several miles away, arriving on horseback or by wagon whatever the hour and whatever the weather, and her arrival was, for the laboring mother, a genuine source of comfort in a moment that carried real and serious risk. I do not want to understate this. Childbirth in the 1880s was dangerous in a way that is difficult to fully convey to a modern audience accustomed to hospital deliveries and modern obstetric care. Maternal mortality rates were significantly higher than anything we would consider acceptable today, and infant mortality was higher still, a fact so woven into the fabric of ordinary life that most families of this era experienced the loss of at least one child before adulthood, sometimes several. This was not spoken of casually, and it was not without grief, real and devastating grief, that mothers and fathers carried quietly, often while continuing to manage a household and other children who still needed them. But it was also, in a way that is almost impossible for us now to fully understand, expected, a known and accepted risk of ordinary family life, rather than the singular tragedy it would represent today. A woman who survived childbirth and the recovery period that followed often had precious little time to actually rest. Lying in, as the postpartum recovery period was sometimes called, might last a week or two in wealthier households where hired help or extended family could manage the domestic work in the meantime. But for a poorer farm wife, the demands of the household frequently pulled her back into full labor within days, sometimes even sooner, because the cows still needed milking and the other children still needed feeding, regardless of how her own body was healing. Babies, once safely delivered, entered a world of childcare that would strike modern parents as strange in a dozen different ways at once. Swaddling remained common, infants wrapped tightly in cloth bands that restricted movement of the limbs, a practice believed to help the child's bones grow straight and to soothe the baby into calmness, though modern understanding of infant development would raise real concerns about the practice as it was sometimes carried out. Cribs, where families could afford one, were simple wooden constructions, though many infants in poorer households simply slept beside their mothers or in a dresser drawer improvised into a makeshift bassinet. A detail that always strikes people as almost unbelievably resourceful when I mention it, feeding an infant who could not be breastfed, whether due to the mother's illness, death, or simply insufficient milk supply, presented a genuine crisis in an era before reliable infant formula existed in anything like its modern form. Wet nurses, other lactating women hired or asked to nurse a child not their own, remained a common solution, particularly in wealthier households, though for poorer families, cow's milk, often diluted and sweetened, sometimes with a little flour added to thicken it, served as an imperfect substitute that carried real risks of contamination and digestive illness in an era before pasteurization was widely practiced. Infant mortality from what was broadly called summer complaint, essentially severe diarrheal illness caused by spoiled milk in the heat of the summer months, was a genuine and recurring cause of death for young children throughout this decade, particularly in crowded urban tenements where clean milk was harder to come by, and harder still to keep from spoiling in the heat. As children grew past infancy, discipline in most 1880s households operated according to a philosophy that would strike many modern parents as severe, though it is worth understanding it on its own terms, rather than simply through a lens of modern disapproval. Corporal punishment, a switch or a hand applied to a misbehaving child, was widely accepted, not as cruelty, but as a fundamental and necessary part of raising a child properly, rooted deeply in religious teaching that emphasized the correction of a child's natural sinfulness and in a broader cultural belief that a child's will needed to be actively shaped and, where necessary, broken toward obedience. That said, and I think this nuance genuinely matters, the relationship between parent and child in this era was not, generally speaking, cold or distant simply because discipline was strict by modern standards. Letters and diaries from ordinary 19th century parents are full of genuine tenderness, worry, pride, and affection for their children, the same emotional textures that any parent today would recognize immediately. A mother who might switch a child for a serious lie or a dangerous act of disobedience might, an hour later, be found rocking that same child to sleep with a hand gently stroking their hair, singing whatever hymn or folk tune her own mother had sung to her. These two things, strictness and tenderness, coexisted without much apparent contradiction in the 19th century mind, in a way that is worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past. Education for these children varied enormously depending on where in the country they happened to be born. In rural areas, the one-room schoolhouse was the dominant model, a single teacher, often a young unmarried woman herself barely out of her teens, responsible for instructing children ranging in age from perhaps 6 all the way to 16, all in the same room, at the same time, working through wildly different levels of material simultaneously. This sounds, from a modern perspective, almost impossibly chaotic, but the system had its own internal logic. Older students frequently helped teach younger ones, a practice that reinforced the older child's own learning while genuinely easing the burden on a single overworked teacher, managing perhaps 30 or more students of vastly different ages and abilities at once. The school year itself in farming communities bent entirely around the agricultural calendar, with long breaks during planting and harvest seasons, when children's labor was needed at home more urgently than their attendance was needed in the classroom. This meant that many rural children, particularly boys whose labor was considered especially valuable during harvest, might complete only a handful of years of formal schooling in total, spread out over a much longer span of childhood than the concept implies. Literacy rates, remarkably, remained fairly high even under these circumstances, since the McGuffey Readers, a series of graded textbooks that dominated American classrooms through this entire era, combined basic reading instruction with a heavy dose of moral and religious teaching that many adults of this generation could still recite passages from decades later. Now let us slow down here for a moment and talk about leisure, because even inside lives this physically demanding, people found time, or perhaps more accurately, made time, for genuine pleasure and community. It would be a mistake to imagine the 1880s as pure grinding labor without relief, because that is simply not how ordinary people actually lived, then or now. Sunday, above nearly everything else, structured the social calendar of the vast majority of American households. Church attendance was not merely a religious observance for most families of this era, it was the single most consistent social gathering available to them, a weekly opportunity to see neighbors who might otherwise be scattered across miles of farmland, to exchange news, to court, to gossip, gently or otherwise, and to simply be seen and known within a community that, for all its physical isolation during the working week, remained genuinely tightly knit. The denominational landscape of rural America in this decade was remarkably varied, Methodist and Baptist churches dominating much of the South and parts of the Midwest, Lutheran congregations thick through areas of heavy German and Scandinavian settlement, Catholic parishes anchoring Irish and Italian immigrant communities in cities and increasingly in rural areas as well. Whatever the specific denomination, the rhythm of the Sunday service itself, hymns sung without instrumental accompaniment in many smaller rural churches, a sermon that might run considerably longer than modern congregations would tolerate, sometimes well over an hour, followed by socializing on the church grounds afterward that could stretch on for the better part of the remaining afternoon, provided a structure that ordinary Americans genuinely oriented their entire week around. Beyond church there were quilting bees, and here I want to spend a moment because this particular ritual captures something genuinely lovely about how 19th century women transformed necessary labor into community and pleasure simultaneously. Quilting, on its most basic level, was practical, a way of using every scrap of usable fabric from worn-out clothing to create warm bedding for a family that could not afford to waste material. But the actual construction of a quilt, particularly the final step of stitching the top layer, batting, and backing together, was frequently done communally, women from across the neighborhood gathering at one household for an entire day, quilt stretched across a large frame, needles moving in practiced rhythm while conversation flowed freely around them. These gatherings were, in a very real sense, one of the primary spaces where women could speak openly among themselves, away from the presence of husbands and fathers, sharing genuine concerns, practical advice about childrearing or household management, and simple companionship that the isolation of individual farm life otherwise made scarce. A young unmarried woman attending her first quilting bee might learn, alongside the actual stitching technique, an entire unspoken curriculum about marriage, motherhood, and the particular art of managing a household and a husband both, absorbed through the conversation happening around her, rather than through any direct instruction. Courtship itself followed patterns that were, depending on region and social class, either fairly formal or considerably looser than popular imagination of the Victorian era generally assumes. In more prosperous or urban households, courtship might involve a young man calling formally at a young woman's home, sitting in the parlor under the watchful, if often only partially attentive supervision of her parents, a period of increasingly serious visits that might extend over a year or more before an actual proposal of marriage was made. In rural communities, courtship often happened more organically, at church gatherings, at barn raisings, at the occasional community dance held in someone's largest available room or barn, where a fiddle player and perhaps a caller for square dances provided the evening's entertainment. I find this particular detail genuinely charming, so let me linger on it a moment. Letters played an enormous role in courtship throughout this decade, particularly for couples separated by any real distance, whether by a young man's seasonal work elsewhere or simply the practical difficulty of regular travel across rural distances. These letters, many of which survive in family collections and historical archives today, reveal a level of genuine emotional openness and tenderness that might surprise people who imagine the Victorian era as universally buttoned up and emotionally restrained. Young men wrote to the objects of their affection with real vulnerability, worrying over whether their feelings were returned, describing small daily details of their lives with a hopeful eye towards sharing a future together, in language that, once you strip away the somewhat formal vocabulary of the period, reads as genuinely, recognizably human. The mail itself deserves a moment of attention here, because it represented something genuinely significant in ordinary 19th century life that we have almost entirely lost the feeling of today. A letter was not one message among a constant stream of them. It was for many families a rare and significant event, arriving perhaps once a week, or even less often in more remote areas, carried by a rural mail carrier on horseback, or by wagon along routes that could stretch for many miles. The arrival of the mail was, in many small communities, a genuine daily or weekly occasion, families walking or riding into town specifically to check whether anything had come for them, and a letter from a distant relative or a courting partner might be read aloud to the entire assembled family, then reread privately, then kept and reread again over following weeks, worn soft at the folds from handling. Newspapers arrived through this same postal system, and their role in ordinary daily life is worth pausing on as well. A family might subscribe to a local weekly paper covering nearby news, alongside perhaps a larger regional or national paper that arrived less frequently and carried news of events happening well beyond the immediate community, sometimes weeks after the fact given the delays inherent in 19th century distribution, though this was rapidly improving as railroads expanded their reach through this exact decade. Reading the newspaper aloud in the evening, often by the head of household to the assembled family, was a genuine ritual in many homes, a way of staying connected to a wider world that most ordinary Americans would otherwise have very little direct contact with in the entire course of their daily lives. Let us go back into the kitchen for a while, because there is so much more to say about food, and it touches nearly every other part of daily life we have already discussed. Food in the 1880s was, above almost everything else, seasonal in a way that modern grocery shopping has made almost impossible to fully understand from the inside. Late summer and early autumn brought the single most labor-intensive stretch of the entire domestic calendar for most rural women, the canning and preserving season, during which an enormous portion of the family's food for the coming winter had to be processed and stored within a relatively narrow window of a few weeks, timed to whatever the garden and orchard happened to be producing. Tomatoes, green beans, corn, peaches, apples, whatever a family had managed to grow or trade for, all needed to be washed, prepared, and sealed into glass jars, a process that involved hours standing over a boiling water bath. The kitchen turned into something close to a sauna in the already stifling heat of late summer. The mason jar itself, patented decades earlier but by this point widely available and increasingly affordable, represented a genuine transformation in how ordinary families could preserve food safely, its screw-top lid and rubber gasket creating a seal that, done correctly, could keep food safely edible for the better part of a year. Margaret, our composite farm wife, might spend an entire week of long days doing nothing but canning, jar after jar lined up cooling on the kitchen table and windowsills, the particular satisfying sound of lids sealing, a soft metallic pop as the jar cooled and the vacuum formed, punctuating the afternoon at irregular intervals. Beyond canning, root cellars served as the other essential piece of winter food storage infrastructure, a dugout space, often beneath the house itself or in a separate mound structure nearby, kept naturally cool and humid enough to store potatoes, carrots, turnips, onions, and other root vegetables for months without spoiling, along with barrels of apples packed carefully to prevent bruising and the spread of rot from one damaged fruit to its neighbors. A well-stocked root cellar going into November represented genuine security for a family, the difference between a comfortable winter and a genuinely difficult one, and checking on it regularly, removing any vegetables that had begun to spoil before they could affect the rest of the store, became one of the quiet, recurring tasks of the cold months. Meat preservation followed its own seasonal logic entirely tied to temperature. Hog butchering, in most farming communities, happened specifically in late fall or early winter, timed to the first genuinely cold snap of the season, because the cold weather itself served as a kind of natural refrigeration during the day's long process of slaughtering, cutting, and preserving an animal that might provide the bulk of a family's meat for the entire coming year. This was, in nearly every farming community, a genuinely communal event, neighboring families gathering to help each other on butchering day, since the process required more hands than a single family could easily provide, and the labor was reciprocated when the neighboring family's turn came around a few days or weeks later. Nearly every part of the animal found some use, a fact that modern audiences sometimes find almost unbelievable given how much of a modern hog carcass simply gets discarded. Hams and shoulders were salted and smoked for long-term storage, hung in a smokehouse, a small separate structure where a slow smouldering fire of hickory or applewood, chosen specifically for the flavor it imparted, burned for days at a time. Fat was rendered into lard, an essential cooking ingredient used for everything from frying to baking to greasing a griddle. Even the intestines were cleaned and used as sausage casings, and the less desirable cuts went into scrapple or head cheese, dishes born entirely out of the practical necessity of wasting nothing from an animal that had taken real resources and real labor to raise. Regional food differences across the country in this decade were considerably more pronounced than they are today, largely because a family's diet depended so heavily on what could actually be grown or raised locally. Given the genuine difficulty and expense of transporting food any real distance before refrigerated rail cars became widely available later in the century, in New England, a diet built around baked beans, brown bread, salt cod, and the particular preserved fish and shellfish traditions of a region with a long coastal fishing economy reflected both the available ingredients and a set of culinary habits inherited from earlier generations of English settlement. In the upper Midwest, particularly in areas with heavy Scandinavian and German settlement, dishes like lutefisk, a preserved cod treated with lye that produces a genuinely distinctive texture, some describe fondly and others describe as an acquired taste at best, alongside dense breads and preserved cabbage in the form of sauerkraut, reflected the specific food traditions immigrant families had carried with them across the Atlantic and adapted to whatever ingredients were locally available in their new home. In the Southwest, Mexican and indigenous culinary traditions, corn tortillas, beans, chilies, remained the foundation of daily eating for the substantial Mexican-American and Native American populations of the region, a food culture that predated American westward expansion into the area by many centuries, and that Anglo settlers arriving in this period were, in many cases, adopting elements of themselves. Sugar, in this era, remained a genuine luxury for many households, expensive enough that honey or maple syrup, where locally available, often served as the primary sweetener for everyday cooking, sugar itself reserved for special occasions or particular dishes where nothing else would properly substitute. This meant that the constant, casual sweetness so common in modern American food, present in everything from bread to sauces to drinks, without anyone particularly noticing it, was largely absent from the ordinary 19th century diet, most food carrying a flavor profile that modern palates, accustomed to a baseline level of sweetness in nearly everything, would likely find surprisingly plain, even a little austere. I want to mention one more food-related detail here because it genuinely fascinates me every time I encounter it in the historical record, which is the sheer amount of preserved and pickled food that appeared on an ordinary 19th century table, not as a specialty item the way pickles or preserves might function today, but as a genuine dietary staple, particularly through the winter months when fresh produce simply was not available at all. Pickled cucumbers, pickled beets, pickled eggs, chow chow, a relish made from whatever vegetables happened to be left over at the end of the growing season, chopped fine and preserved in vinegar. These were not occasional treats. They were, for months at a stretch, simply what vegetables meant, and an ordinary 19th century child likely grew up with a relationship to sour, fermented and pickled flavors that would strike many modern children, raised on a much sweeter and blander baseline, as genuinely intense. Let us talk now about light and warmth, two things so automatic in modern life that we genuinely never think about them, but which structured an enormous portion of ordinary 19th century daily existence, particularly once the sun went down. Kerosene lamps had, by the 1880s, largely replaced the tallow candles and whale oil lamps of earlier generations, kerosene itself being considerably cheaper and cleaner burning than the alternatives that had come before it. Still, a kerosene lamp produced a genuinely dim, flickering light by modern standards, casting long shadows across a room and requiring real care in its handling, since a knocked-over lamp was a leading cause of house fires throughout this entire era, a fear that lived somewhere in the back of every household's collective mind, particularly with small children moving through rooms lit by open flame. The ritual of lamp lighting itself, performed each evening as daylight faded, involved trimming the wick to the correct length, since a wick trimmed too long produced a smoky, uneven flame that coated the glass chimney with soot, requiring it to be cleaned the following morning, the glass wiped carefully with a soft cloth or crumpled newspaper until it shone clear again. Families budgeted their kerosene carefully, since it did cost real money, and most ordinary households did not burn lamps freely through an entire evening the way we might leave lights on today without a second thought. A single lamp, placed at the center of the kitchen table where the family gathered after supper, often provided the only light for an entire household's evening activities, everyone drawing close to its limited circle of illumination to read, to sew, to work at whatever task the evening called for. Heating followed a similarly hands-on, labor-intensive logic. The same cookstove that had prepared breakfast in the dark hours of early morning also served, in many smaller homes, as the primary source of heat for the entire house, meaning the kitchen frequently became the genuine heart of family life during the cold months, the warmest room in the house, and therefore the room where everyone naturally gathered. Larger or more prosperous homes might have a separate parlor stove, or even, in wealthier households, a fireplace in multiple rooms, but for most ordinary families, winter meant a house with genuinely wide temperature variation from room to room, the kitchen warm and inviting, bedrooms often bracingly cold enough that a family might keep heated stones or bricks, wrapped carefully in cloth, tucked beneath the blankets to warm a bed before anyone actually climbed into it. Firewood itself represented an enormous ongoing labor commitment for any rural family, an entire woodpile needing to be cut, split, and stacked well before the cold weather actually arrived, since a family caught short on firewood in the middle of a hard winter faced a genuinely dangerous situation. This work fell primarily to the men and older boys of the household, wielding axes and cross-cut saws through what could be weeks of dedicated labor in the autumn months, and the size and neatness of a family's woodpile, visible to any neighbor passing by, carried a certain quiet social significance, a visible marker of how well prepared and how hard-working a particular household was considered to be. Furniture in an ordinary 19th century home tended toward the simple and the durable, rather than anything approaching decorative luxury, though there were, even in modest households, usually a small handful of pieces that carried genuine sentimental and even aspirational weight. A rocking chair, perhaps inherited from a parent or grandparent, held a particular place of honor, often positioned nearest the stove or fireplace, reserved by unspoken family custom for whoever was oldest, or, in the evening hours, for the mother nursing an infant or mending by lamplight. A trundle bed, which could be pushed beneath a larger bed during the day to save floor space and pulled out at night for children to sleep on, represented a particularly practical piece of 19th century furniture design that modern audiences sometimes find genuinely clever when they first learn about it. Wallpaper, where a family could afford it, was considered a genuine mark of respectability and care for one's home. Patterns often floral or geometric, printed in colors that have, in the surviving examples that still exist in museums and preserved houses today, faded considerably from what would have been a much bolder original palette. Poorer households often made do with simple whitewashed walls, or in the case of many log cabin-style homes, still common in more recently settled areas, walls chinked with a mixture of mud and straw between the logs themselves, a construction method inherited from earlier generations of American settlement that remained entirely practical and entirely common well into this decade in newly settled regions. Now, let me tell you about something genuinely strange, because this is the part of the era that I think people find most fascinating once they actually hear it: the superstitions that govern daily behavior in ways both large and small across nearly every region and community in the country. Some of these were rooted in older European folk traditions carried over by successive waves of immigration. Others emerged from a genuinely mixed folk culture that developed uniquely on American soil, blending European, African, and indigenous influences in ways that varied considerably by region. A new baby, in many households, was not to be shown a mirror before a certain age, commonly 1 year, out of a belief that doing so risked the child's soul, or, in a gentler version of the same superstition, might simply cause the baby to have trouble learning to talk. Breaking a mirror carried the famous 7 years of bad luck that persists in some form even today, but the 1880s held dozens of similarly specific beliefs that have since largely faded from common cultural memory. Spilling salt required a pinch thrown immediately over the left shoulder, specifically the left, to blind whatever evil spirit might be lurking there waiting to take advantage of the small misfortune. Certain days carried genuine significance for beginning particular tasks. Starting a quilt on a Friday, in many households, was considered to doom the project to being unfinished or unlucky in some vague but persistently believed way. A rooster crowing at an unusual hour, particularly after dark, was widely taken as an omen of death approaching the household, a belief serious enough that some families would genuinely react with real anxiety and even, in some documented cases, go check on elderly or ill relatives immediately after hearing it. A bird flying into the house through an open window was considered an omen of death or, at minimum, seriously bad news to come, and the appropriate response, in many regional traditions, involved immediately opening every other window and door in the house to help the bird find its way back out as quickly as possible, since its continued presence indoors was believed to worsen whatever misfortune it had come to announce. Weather prediction. In an era without any reliable scientific forecasting available to ordinary people, relied almost entirely on this same body of folk observation, passed down through generations and trusted with a seriousness that modern audiences, accustomed to checking a phone for tomorrow's forecast, might find genuinely touching in its earnestness. A ring around the moon meant rain was coming, and coming soon, the width of the ring even believed by some to indicate roughly how many days remained before the weather turned. Woolly caterpillars, examined closely for the width of their orange and black bands, were believed to predict the severity of the coming winter, a tradition that, remarkably, persists in some rural communities even today, long after any scientific basis for it has been thoroughly debunked. Cows lying down together in a field, rather than standing and grazing, were taken as a sign that rain was approaching, and farmers genuinely factored these observations into real decisions about when to bring in hay or begin harvesting a field before weather turned against them. Marriage and courtship carried their own dense thicket of superstition layered on top of the practical realities we discussed earlier. A bride was widely believed to need something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue for genuine good luck in her coming marriage, a rhyme and tradition that has remarkably survived largely intact into modern wedding customs even now, a genuine thread connecting a modern bride directly back to her 1880s counterpart without either one necessarily knowing the specific history of the tradition they are both, in their own way, honoring. A groom was not to see his bride's wedding dress before the ceremony itself, and a bride was widely counseled against making her own wedding dress, since doing so was believed, in a piece of folk logic I genuinely find charming, to somehow stitch bad luck directly into the fabric of the marriage itself, thread by thread. Death, too, carried its own elaborate set of customs and practices, and here I want to be honest that we are entering genuinely somber territory for a moment, though I think it is worth understanding, because death was, in this era, handled almost entirely within the home and the immediate community, rather than delegated to outside professionals the way modern American death customs generally function. When a family member died, the body was typically washed and prepared for burial by family members themselves, most often the women of the household, a final, deeply intimate act of care performed for someone they had loved. Clocks in the house were stopped at the exact moment of death, mirrors were covered with black cloth, and the body was laid out in the parlor, often on a cooling board, for a period of viewing that might last several days, during which neighbors and extended family came to pay their respects, sit with the grieving family, and share food, since cooking was, quite reasonably, the last thing anyone expected a grieving household to manage for themselves in those first raw days. This period of viewing in the home is, I think, where the term living room actually originates, or at least this is the widely accepted explanation, since the parlor, the room traditionally used for this exact purpose, gradually came to be called the living room specifically as families began moving away from the practice of displaying the dead within their own homes, choosing instead, as funeral homes became more common toward the end of the century and into the next, to have that solemn work handled elsewhere. Mourning customs following a death were genuinely elaborate, particularly for women, who were expected to wear black clothing for a prescribed period that varied depending on their relationship to the deceased. A widow traditionally expected to observe a full 2 years of mourning, moving through distinct stages marked by increasingly less severe black clothing, before finally being considered free to remarry or simply resume ordinary colored dress. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to circle back to something, and here is where that thread from the beginning of our evening together starts to make a certain kind of sense. Remember the emotional paradox sitting underneath Margaret's mourning, that particular quiet she was keeping around a pregnancy she had not yet announced. Given everything we now know about the genuine risks of childbirth in this era, about the very real possibility of loss that shadowed every single pregnancy, regardless of how carefully a woman ate or how much rest she managed to get, that quiet takes on a different weight, does it not? It was not simply modesty or convention that kept her from speaking of it too early. It was, at least in part, a kind of protective caution, a reluctance to fully name a hope until enough time had passed to trust it might actually be realized. Women of this era carried that particular calculation quietly, almost constantly, a background hum of genuine uncertainty running beneath even their most ordinary days. And yet, life went on around all of this, as it always does, with a kind of stubborn, ordinary momentum that I find myself genuinely moved by every time I sit with this material for long enough. Children were born, and mostly, statistically speaking, survived, grew, married, had children of their own in turn. Meals were cooked 3 times a day, every single day, regardless of grief or joy or simple exhaustion. The wash still needed doing on Monday. The fire still needed lighting before dawn. There is something in the sheer, dogged continuity of it that I think deserves genuine respect. A life lived at ground level, unglamorous, physically demanding, and yet somehow, from the surviving letters and diaries, filled with real moments of laughter and tenderness and simple contentment that the hardship never quite managed to fully extinguish. Let us talk about holidays now, because even inside lives built almost entirely around labor, the calendar still turned up its handful of genuinely special days, and the way ordinary Americans marked them tells you something real about what mattered to them. Christmas in the 1880s looked considerably more modest in most ordinary households than the elaborate gift-heavy version the holiday would eventually become in the following century. A tree, where a family had one at all, a custom that had spread widely through German immigrant influence over the preceding decades and was by this point genuinely common across most of the country, might be decorated with strings of popcorn and cranberries threaded by hand, small candles clipped carefully to the branches and lit only briefly and under close supervision, given the very real fire risk, and perhaps a handful of simple ornaments, paper cutouts, or small carved wooden figures passed down and reused year after year, rather than purchased fresh. Gifts for children tended toward the practical and the modest. A new pair of mittens knitted through the autumn evenings, a simple wooden toy carved by a father in whatever spare hours he could find, an orange, and I want to pause on this specific detail because it genuinely surprises people every time I mention it. An orange placed in the toe of a Christmas stocking represented, for a great many rural American children in this era, a genuinely exciting and memorable gift, since fresh citrus fruit, shipped up from Florida or California by rail, was a rare and seasonal luxury that most children might receive only this once a year. Children who grew up in this era and lived long enough to be interviewed decades later, well into the 20th century, frequently mentioned that orange specifically unprompted as one of their most vivid memories of childhood Christmas, a detail that has always genuinely moved me. Thanksgiving, which had been formally established as a national holiday only 2 decades earlier under Lincoln, had by the 1880s settled into recognizable form, a large midday meal centered around whatever fowl a family could manage. Turkey where affordable and available, though chicken or even a goose served the same symbolic purpose in households where turkey remained too dear an expense. Extended family traveled where distance allowed, gathering for a meal that, then as now, represented one of the few days of the year when an entire extended family might genuinely sit down together at one table, and the labor of preparing that meal, which fell overwhelmingly on the women of the household, began days in advance with the same kind of careful planning and provisioning that any major undertaking of this era required. Independence Day, the 4th of July, carried a different kind of energy entirely, less domestic and more communal. Entire towns gathering for the day, a parade if the community was large enough to organize one, patriotic speeches that could run considerably longer than modern patience would tolerate, and fireworks in the evening, a genuine spectacle for communities that otherwise had very little in the way of visual entertainment beyond what nature and the changing seasons provided on their own. Firecrackers, smaller and more accessible than full fireworks displays, were sold cheaply and set off by children throughout the day with what most modern parents would consider genuinely alarming levels of unsupervised enthusiasm, injuries from careless firecracker handling being common enough each 4th of July that newspapers of the era routinely reported on them the following day, almost as an expected feature of the holiday, rather than a genuine scandal. The county fair, held in late summer or early autumn in most agricultural regions, represented perhaps the single largest annual community gathering for rural Americans, and it served a purpose considerably more practical than pure entertainment, though the entertainment value was real and genuinely anticipated all year. Farmers brought their best livestock and produce to be judged and displayed, a genuine matter of pride and reputation within the farming community, a blue ribbon for the largest pumpkin or the finest hog carrying real social weight that a family might discuss and reference for years afterward. Women entered quilts, preserves, baked goods, and needlework into their own categories of competition, and winning a ribbon for a particularly fine quilt represented a genuine and hard-won form of public recognition for skills that otherwise went almost entirely unacknowledged outside the household itself. Beyond the formal holidays, ordinary evening entertainment relied heavily on music made within the home itself, since recorded sound simply did not exist yet in any commercially accessible form. A family fortunate enough to own a piano, or more commonly and affordably, a parlor organ, might gather around it most evenings, someone playing while others sang hymns or the popular sentimental ballads of the day, songs about lost loves and dying children, and distant homes that strike modern ears as almost operatically melancholy, but that captured something genuinely resonant for an audience whose own lives were shadowed by exactly these kinds of loss and distance. Where no instrument was available, families sang unaccompanied, or a father or older sibling might play a fiddle or a harmonica, simpler and more affordable instruments that were considerably more common in poorer rural households than a piano ever could be. Reading aloud, which we touched on briefly regarding newspapers, extended well beyond the news itself into genuine literature, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, because the 1880s represented something of a golden age for serialized fiction published in magazines and newspapers, novels released chapter by chapter over weeks or months, building genuine, sustained anticipation within a household for the next installment, the way a modern audience might anticipate the next episode of a favorite show. Charles Dickens, though English rather than American, remained enormously popular, and homegrown American writers like Mark Twain, whose Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was published in this exact decade, in 1884, found genuinely wide readership among ordinary American families who might otherwise own very few books at all beyond the family Bible and perhaps a well-worn almanac. Card games and simple board games filled many evening hours as well, particularly in winter when the workday ended earlier and the evening stretched longer before it. Checkers, a genuinely ancient game requiring no special equipment beyond a board that could easily be hand-drawn and pieces improvised from buttons or dried corn kernels if a proper set was not available, remained enormously popular across every social class. Card games carried their own regional and religious variation, since some of the stricter Protestant denominations of this era genuinely frowned upon card playing as a moral concern, bordering on outright gambling, meaning a family's relationship to something as simple as a deck of cards could reveal a good deal about their particular religious and cultural background. Let us talk a little more about the economic lives of ordinary women in this era, because there is genuine complexity here that deserves more room than we have given it so far, and it moves well beyond the factory floor and the domestic service we already discussed. Teaching, particularly in rural areas, represented one of the very few professions considered genuinely respectable for a young educated woman to pursue before marriage, and by the 1880s, women had come to dominate the teaching profession numerically, particularly at the elementary level, having largely replaced the male schoolmasters who were more common in earlier decades. A young woman teacher, often barely older than her oldest students, typically boarded with a local family in the community where she taught, moving from household to household over the course of a school year in a practice known as boarding round, since the school district itself frequently could not afford to pay her enough to independently rent a room of her own, and this arrangement also allowed the burden and, in some communities, the genuine privilege of hosting the teacher to be shared more fairly among the local families whose children she instructed. The pay itself was modest by any standard, often less than what a male teacher in the same position might have earned, a disparity that was simply accepted as normal within the economic logic of the era, and a teaching career, in the vast majority of communities, was understood to be genuinely temporary, a bridge occupation a young woman held only until marriage, at which point she was expected, and in many districts actually required by explicit policy, to resign her position entirely. This meant that the teaching workforce turned over constantly, experienced teachers leaving the profession just as they were becoming genuinely skilled at it, replaced by a fresh crop of young, inexperienced women each time, a structural inefficiency that few at the time seemed to question very seriously, since the underlying assumption that a married woman belonged in her own home rather than in paid employment remained largely unchallenged across most of American society in this decade. For women who did not pursue teaching and were not employed in a factory or as domestic servants, piecework offered another avenue of earning at least some independent income. Work done at home on a per-item basis, sewing garments, rolling cigars, assembling artificial flowers, or a dozen other small manufacturing tasks that a manufacturer would distribute to women working from their own kitchens rather than requiring them to travel to a central factory floor. This arrangement allowed a woman to earn something while still managing her household and children, a genuine practical advantage, but the pay rates were notoriously low, often calculated to just barely make the labor worthwhile, and manufacturers benefited enormously from a workforce that provided its own space, heat and light, none of which the woman doing the piecework was compensated for separately. Taking in boarders represented yet another common source of household income, particularly for widows or women whose husbands earned insufficient wages on their own, a family renting out a spare room, or in more crowded arrangements, simply a shared bed in a shared room, to unmarried working men or newly arrived immigrants who needed lodging and were willing to pay for it. This arrangement demanded real additional labor from the woman of the house, extra cooking, extra laundry, extra cleaning, but it also brought welcome income directly into a household budget that might otherwise be stretched dangerously thin, and many working-class urban families depended on boarder income as an absolutely essential component of making ends meet from month to month. Widowhood itself deserves specific attention here, because it represented one of the genuinely most precarious situations an ordinary 19th century woman could find herself in. With no widespread system of life insurance reliably in place for most working-class or farming families, and no social safety net of any kind resembling what would eventually develop in the following century, a woman whose husband died, particularly if she had young children still at home, faced immediate and serious economic crisis. Some widows managed to keep a farm running with the help of older children or hired labor, though this required a level of physical and managerial capability that society did not always readily credit women with possessing. Others moved in with extended family, a married sibling or her own aging parents, trading independence for genuine security. Still others remarried, sometimes within a period that strikes modern audiences as remarkably fast, and this was not, generally speaking, viewed as a lack of feeling for the deceased husband, but rather as simple, practical necessity, a recognition that a household genuinely required two adults working in tandem to function, and that grief, however real, did not pay the mortgage or feed the children. Now let us talk about how people actually moved through this world, because transportation shaped daily life in ways that are genuinely hard to fully imagine from inside a world of cars and highways and same-day travel across enormous distances. For most ordinary rural Americans, walking remained the default mode of transportation for any distance under a few miles, and a few miles represented a considerably less daunting prospect to 19th century legs than it might to modern ones, accustomed as we now are to driving even genuinely short distances without a second thought. Beyond walking, the horse, in its various forms, dominated everything. A single riding horse for quick trips into town, a wagon drawn by one or two horses or mules for hauling goods and larger groups of people, and on the farm itself, draft horses, considerably larger and stronger animals, bred specifically for pulling plows and heavy equipment, represented one of the single largest capital investments an ordinary farming family owned, a good team of horses genuinely comparable in relative value to what a reliable vehicle might represent to a family today, and treated, correspondingly, with real care, since the loss of a horse to illness or injury could represent a genuine financial catastrophe on top of whatever emotional attachment the family had developed toward an animal they worked alongside every single day. The railroad, meanwhile, was in the process of genuinely transforming American life during exactly this decade, tracks spreading rapidly across the country, connecting communities that had previously been isolated by days of overland travel into a network that could move people and goods across enormous distances in a fraction of the time. For an ordinary family, a train journey remained a significant and somewhat rare event, reserved for genuinely important occasions, a move to a new region entirely, a visit to distant family that would otherwise be impossible, rather than a casual everyday mode of transportation. The train station itself, in towns fortunate enough to be located along a rail line, became a genuine center of community life and economic activity, since a town connected by rail had access to markets and goods that an isolated community simply could not match, a fact that shaped which towns thrived and which gradually withered as the railroad map of the country continued to take shape through this exact period. Let us slow all the way down now and move through the seasons themselves, because the rhythm of an entire year, not just a single day, shaped ordinary American life in this decade in ways worth sitting with properly. Winter, particularly in the northern states and across the plains, brought a genuine and serious kind of isolation that is difficult to fully convey to anyone who has never lived without reliable transportation through heavy snow. A farming family might find itself genuinely cut off from town, from neighbors, from any outside contact at all, for days or even weeks at a stretch, snow drifting high enough against fences and roads to make travel by wagon or even horseback genuinely dangerous, sometimes impossible. Stores of food laid in during the autumn canning and harvest season took on real, sometimes literal life or death significance during these stretches, and a family's winter survival depended entirely on the thoroughness of preparations made months earlier when the harvest was still coming in and the root cellar was being filled. The cold itself was a constant physical presence in a way that modern heated homes have made almost impossible to imagine. Waking in an unheated upstairs bedroom to find the water in a wash basin frozen solid overnight was simply an ordinary feature of winter life, not a household emergency, but an expected inconvenience managed with a practiced shrug and perhaps a small fire hastily built if the room's occupant could not stand it any longer. Children slept 2, 3, sometimes 4 to a bed, not merely out of space constraints, but because shared body heat under a pile of heavy quilts represented genuine, meaningful warmth in a house where the fire had died down overnight and would not be relit until someone rose in the pre-dawn dark to tend it. Frostbite and, in genuinely severe cases, death from exposure, particularly for anyone caught outside during an unexpected blizzard, represented real and recurring winter dangers that rural newspapers of the era reported on with grim regularity each cold season. And yet winter also brought its own particular pleasures, precisely because the outdoor agricultural labor that consumed nearly every other season eased considerably once the ground froze and the crops were long since harvested and stored. This was, for many farming families, the closest thing to genuine leisure time the entire year provided. Evenings stretching long and dark from mid-afternoon onward, filled with exactly the kind of reading, music and handwork we discussed earlier, and it was winter, more than any other season, when the deepest, most sustained family closeness tended to develop. Everyone gathered around the same stove through the same long evenings, week after week, in a way that summer's endless outdoor labor simply did not allow for. Spring arrived with its own distinct character entirely, and mud, more than anything else, defined the early weeks of the season across most of rural America. Roads that had been passable, if rough, through the frozen winter months turned to genuine, wheel-swallowing mud as the ground thawed. A wagon sinking to its axles, a common enough occurrence that most rural travelers simply expected and planned around the very real possibility of it. Spring also brought planting, the entire agricultural calendar suddenly accelerating into its most urgent and labor-intensive stretch, since a crop planted even a week or two later than ideal could mean a genuinely diminished harvest come autumn, and farmers watched the weather and the soil with an intensity that modern audiences, several steps removed from any direct dependence on a single harvest for their entire year's food and income, can find difficult to fully appreciate. This ritual of spring cleaning, a tradition that survives in diminished form even today, represented a genuinely enormous undertaking in the 1880s, considerably more involved than its modern equivalent, an entire house having been sealed up tight against the cold for months, heated by wood and coal smoke that left a real residue of soot and grime across walls, curtains and furniture, required a thorough, top-to-bottom cleaning once warmer weather finally allowed windows to be opened freely again. Carpets, where a family owned any, were dragged outside entirely and beaten across a clothesline or fence rail with a specially designed carpet beater, releasing clouds of dust and grime that had accumulated invisibly over the entire winter, a task that could take an entire day for even a modestly sized rug, and left the person performing it thoroughly exhausted and covered in a fine grey film by the time the job was finally done. Summer brought its own distinct labour and its own distinct discomforts. Heat, in an era entirely without air conditioning or even reliably effective mechanical fans in most households, was managed through architecture and habit rather than technology. Houses built where possible, with cross-ventilation in mind, deep porches providing genuine relief from direct sun, and the timing of the heaviest physical labor shifted, where the crop allowed it, toward the cooler hours of early morning and evening, with the worst heat of midday reserved, when possible, for lighter indoor tasks or, if truly fortunate, a brief period of rest. Harvest time itself, arriving in mid to late summer, depending on the crop and the region, represented the single most physically demanding stretch of the entire agricultural year, entire families working from the earliest usable light until genuine darkness made further labor impossible, racing against the real possibility of a sudden storm that could damage or destroy a crop that represented an entire year's income in the span of a single bad afternoon. Harvest, precisely because of its urgency and its stakes, was also one of the most genuinely communal undertakings of the entire farming calendar, neighboring families combining their labor to bring in each other's crops in succession, since a single family, working alone, often could not manage the harvest of even their own fields quickly enough before weather or overripeness threatened to claim a meaningful portion of what they had spent the entire growing season cultivating. These harvest crews, moving from farm to farm across a community over the course of several intense weeks, were fed enormous midday meals by the women of whichever household was currently being harvested, a genuine point of pride and reputation, since a farm wife known for setting a particularly generous and well-prepared harvest table found her family's crew arriving with real enthusiasm each season, while a household with a reputation for stinginess at the table might find its harvest help considerably harder to secure when it mattered most. Word of a poor table traveling through a farming community almost as quickly and almost as durably as word of a good one, the kind of quiet reputation that could follow a family for years. Now, let us widen the picture a little further, because ordinary American life in the 1880s cannot be honestly told only through the eyes of settlers and city dwellers of European descent. This was a decade of genuine, often violent transformation across the western half of the continent, and the ordinary daily life of Native American communities during this exact period looked nothing at all like the world we have been describing so far, and deserves to be spoken of honestly rather than glossed over. By the 1880s, the majority of native nations across the plains and much of the West had been forced, through a combination of military conquest, broken treaties, and deliberate policy, onto reservations, land that was, in the overwhelming majority of cases, a fraction of what these nations had previously inhabited, and often among the least agriculturally productive land available in the entire region. The buffalo, which had formed the absolute center of daily and spiritual life for Plains nations including the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Comanche among many others, had been hunted to near extinction over the preceding 2 decades, a deliberate strategy pursued in part by military and government officials, who understood explicitly that destroying the buffalo herds would destroy the economic and cultural independence of the nations who depended on them. Daily life on a reservation in this decade was shaped overwhelmingly by dependence on government rations, often inadequate, sometimes deliberately withheld as a tool of coercion, and by policies that actively worked to suppress native language, religious practice, and traditional ways of life. Children were, with increasing frequency through this exact period, taken from their families and sent to boarding schools explicitly designed to strip away native culture and identity, institutions whose founding philosophy was stated with a bluntness that is genuinely difficult to read even now, the stated goal being, in the infamous words of one of the era's most prominent school founders, to kill the Indian and save the man. I mention this not to dwell in horror for its own sake, but because any honest account of ordinary American life in this decade has to include it, since it was happening in the very same years that Margaret was canning tomatoes in Ohio and Anna was working a factory floor in New York. And yet, even under these genuinely brutal circumstances, native communities did not simply disappear or surrender their identity, whatever the explicit goals of federal policy might have been. Traditional practices continued, sometimes openly where circumstances allowed, sometimes carried forward quietly, privately, in defiance of policies designed to eliminate them entirely. Elders continued teaching children language and story and craft, whenever and however they safely could, a form of quiet, persistent resistance that ensured these nations and their cultures survived a period specifically engineered to destroy them, a resilience that deserves genuine acknowledgement alongside the very real suffering of the era. Meanwhile, the westward expansion of white settlement continued apace through this exact decade, and the ordinary daily life of homesteaders on this rapidly shifting frontier carried its own particular character, distinct even from the more established farming communities of the Midwest we discussed earlier. A homesteading family arriving on the plains in the early 1880s faced a landscape and a set of challenges that could differ enormously from what an established Ohio or Pennsylvania farm family would have recognized. Isolation was often considerably more severe, the nearest neighbor sometimes miles distant rather than a short walk away, and the nearest town, with its store and its post office and its church, might represent a full day's journey by wagon rather than a simple morning's errand. Women on this frontier carried a particular and specific kind of burden that deserves its own mention, since the isolation of homestead life fell especially heavily on wives and mothers, who might go weeks at a time without seeing another adult woman to talk to, an absence that historians have since connected to genuinely significant rates of what the era vaguely termed prairie madness, a kind of severe depression and psychological distress brought on by the combination of relentless physical labor, genuine isolation, and the sheer visual monotony of an endless, largely featureless horizon that some women described, in surviving letters and diaries, as beginning to feel almost physically oppressive over time. Diaries from this specific population of women contain some of the rawest, most emotionally honest writing to survive from the entire decade. Women describing genuine despair alongside genuine moments of fierce pride in what they were building, sometimes within the very same letter, a complexity that I think deserves to be taken seriously rather than flattened into either pure tragedy or pure pioneer triumph. Let us return, for a while, to the immigrant experience specifically, because we touched on it earlier through Anna's factory work. But there is more texture here worth exploring, since immigration during this decade was reshaping American cities and rural communities alike in ways that varied enormously depending on which particular group we are talking about. Chinese immigrants, concentrated particularly on the West Coast following earlier waves of migration during the gold rush and railroad construction decades, faced a level of explicit, legally codified discrimination that distinguished their experience sharply from that of most European immigrant groups. The Chinese Exclusion Act, passed in 1882, right in the middle of this exact decade, represented the first major American law to explicitly restrict immigration based on race and nationality, and Chinese communities that had already established themselves in cities like San Francisco faced ongoing violence, legal discrimination, and a level of social exclusion that European immigrant groups, whatever prejudice they also genuinely faced, were not subjected to in nearly the same systematic, legally enforced way. Scandinavian immigrants, by contrast, settling heavily through Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakota Territory, found a climate and landscape that many described, with a mixture of relief and genuine homesickness, as reminding them powerfully of the countries they had left behind, and these communities often maintained their language, their Lutheran religious practice, and many of their specific food traditions with remarkable continuity for multiple generations. Entire rural townships where Swedish or Norwegian remained the primary spoken language well into the following century. German immigrants, the single largest immigrant group in the country through much of this era, settled widely enough from Pennsylvania to Texas to the upper Midwest that their influence touched nearly every region of the country in some form, from beer brewing traditions that fundamentally reshaped American drinking culture to the widespread adoption of the Christmas tree we discussed earlier, a custom that entered broader American practice specifically through German immigrant influence. Let us talk about beauty for a while, because the standards and practices of the 1880s, when you actually look closely at them, are genuinely stranger than most people expect, full of small contradictions that I find myself smiling over even now. A pale complexion remained, throughout this entire decade, the overwhelming beauty ideal for white American women, a preference rooted in centuries-old class associations, since tanned skins signaled outdoor labor, and therefore, by the logic of the era, a lower social position, while pale, untouched skin signaled a life of leisure spent indoors, away from the sun. Women went to genuinely elaborate lengths to protect and maintain this pallor: wide-brimmed bonnets, parasols carried even for the shortest outdoor errand, and in more extreme cases, various homemade and commercially sold whitening preparations applied directly to the face, some of which, disturbingly, contained genuine lead or arsenic compounds, substances we now understand to be seriously toxic, but that were, at the time, marketed and used with no apparent awareness of the real danger involved. Rosy cheeks, somewhat paradoxically sitting alongside this preference for overall pallor, were also considered genuinely desirable, and women who lacked natural color achieved it through a careful, subtle application of rouge, though the use of visible cosmetics carried a real social stigma in this era, associated culturally with actresses and women of, shall we say, less than respectable reputation. A proper, respectable woman was expected to appear as though she used no cosmetics at all, even if she genuinely did, the art lying entirely in the appearance of naturalness, a contradiction that, if you think about it for a moment, has never entirely left American beauty culture even now, 140 years later. Hair, for women, was almost universally worn long, cut only rarely if ever throughout an adult woman's life, and the daily ritual of brushing it, typically 100 strokes, a number repeated so consistently across the era's advice literature and personal diaries that it had genuinely become an accepted, almost unquestioned standard, was believed to distribute natural oils along the length of the hair and encourage healthy growth. This was styled each morning into whatever arrangement of buns, braids, and pinned curls the current fashion and the woman's own skill dictated, a process that could take a genuinely significant amount of time, particularly for elaborate styles favored among wealthier women who had a servant available specifically to help manage it, though most ordinary women developed their own considerably faster, simpler routines born of practical necessity rather than fashion plate ambition. Weight, interestingly, carried almost the opposite association from what a modern reader might expect. A fuller figure was, throughout most of this decade, considered genuinely more attractive and more respectable than a thin one, since thinness carried associations with poverty, illness, and hard physical deprivation, exactly the conditions that a fashionable woman was meant to visibly, comfortably transcend. Advertisements of the era for various tonics and preparations promised to help a too thin woman gain weight and thereby improve her marriage prospects, a genuine inversion of a beauty pressure that would, within a few generations, flip entirely in the opposite direction. And I think there is something worth noticing in just how completely a beauty standard can reverse itself over time, a reminder that none of these preferences are as fixed or as natural as any single generation tends to assume they are. Etiquette more broadly governed an enormous range of ordinary daily interaction in ways that could seem, to modern eyes, genuinely baffling in their specificity. The calling card, a small printed card bearing a person's name, used in the ritual of formal social visiting, particularly common among middle and upper-class urban women, came with an entire unwritten grammar of meaning depending on how it was presented. A corner turned down in a particular way might indicate the card had been delivered in person rather than by a servant. Cards left with specific corners folded carried different meanings depending on the occasion. A condolence visit signaled differently from a congratulatory one, and a woman navigating this system was expected to understand and correctly execute an entire silent language that a modern observer would need a genuine manual to decode. Though for the women actually living inside this system, it had become as automatic and unremarkable as any other social custom eventually becomes to those who grew up inside it. Table manners, too, carried real social weight, and etiquette manuals of the era, which sold in genuinely large numbers to an American middle class anxious about correctly displaying its respectability, covered an enormous range of specific rules how to properly hold and use the increasingly standardized array of specialized utensils that a formal table setting demanded, how to eat particular foods that presented genuine challenges, corn on the cob for instance, prompting considerable and genuinely earnest debate in etiquette literature about the most proper and least undignified way to actually consume it in polite company. For ordinary working families, of course, much of this elaborate etiquette simply did not apply in daily practice. A farm family eating breakfast before dawn had neither the time nor, frankly, the social pressure to observe rules designed primarily for the parlors and dining rooms of a considerably more leisured class, though even modest households absorbed at least some version of these expectations, particularly around company manners reserved for when guests, a minister perhaps, or a visiting relative, were present at the table. Let us talk about growing old in this era, because aging looked and felt considerably different than it does in modern American life, shaped by an entirely different set of family structures and economic realities. There was, in the 1880s, no such thing as retirement in anything resembling its modern sense, no pension most ordinary workers could rely on, no social security, which would not exist for another half-century, no widespread concept that a person's later years should or even could be a period of rest, separate from labor. A farmer worked his land for as long as his body physically allowed him to, and when it no longer did, the farm typically passed, formally or informally, to a grown son, who took over the heaviest physical labor while the aging father continued contributing whatever lighter tasks his remaining strength permitted, mending harness, tending a smaller garden plot, whittling and repairing tools, teaching grandchildren skills he had spent an entire lifetime accumulating. Multi-generational households were, correspondingly, considerably more common than they are in modern America. An aging parent typically moving in with a grown child's family rather than living independently or, as would become more common in the following century, in any kind of dedicated facility for the elderly, which existed in this era in only the most limited and generally quite grim form, reserved almost entirely for those with no family at all, willing or able to take them in. The county poorhouse, representing a genuinely feared fate that ordinary families worked hard to avoid for their own elderly relatives whenever any alternative at all remained available. This arrangement carried real, complicated texture that deserves honest acknowledgement rather than pure sentimentality. An aging parent living within a grown child's household could represent genuine valued help, an extra pair of hands for childcare, a repository of practical knowledge and experience that a younger generation still actively relied upon in a world where most useful knowledge was transmitted person to person rather than through books or, as would eventually become the case, through institutions entirely separate from the family itself. But it could also represent genuine strain, another mouth to feed and body to care for within a household budget that was for most ordinary families already stretched thin, and diary entries and letters from the era occasionally reveal, with real honesty, the tension this could create. A daughter-in-law managing a household that now included her husband's aging, sometimes difficult mother, navigating a set of competing loyalties and genuine exhaustion that would be entirely recognizable to a modern family facing similar caregiving demands, even if the specific circumstances have changed considerably. Mental illness, and what the era broadly and often crudely termed insanity, deserve honest mention here too, because the treatment of mental illness in the 1880s represents one of the genuinely darker corners of the decade's medical history. State asylums, established in growing numbers through the preceding decades under a reform movement that had genuinely, sincerely believed institutional care represented a humane improvement over the family neglect or outright imprisonment that had often been the fate of the severely mentally ill in earlier generations, had by this point in many cases become severely overcrowded, understaffed, and, whatever their founders' original intentions, frequently more custodial than therapeutic in actual daily practice. A family facing a member's severe mental illness, whether what we would now recognize as schizophrenia, severe depression, postpartum psychosis, or any number of other conditions the era's medical understanding was genuinely ill-equipped to properly diagnose or treat, faced an agonizing set of choices: care for the person at home, often without any real medical guidance or support; commit them to an asylum, where conditions could vary enormously from genuinely well-run and humane institutions to conditions that by any modern standard would be considered outright abusive, or, in the most desperate cases, simply attempt to hide the situation entirely from a community that could be genuinely unforgiving in its judgment of mental illness as a source of shame rather than a medical condition deserving of compassion and proper care. I raise this not to leave you with something heavy right before we ease toward the close of our evening together, but because I think an honest account of ordinary life in any era has to include the genuine hardships alongside the warmth, and because there is something worth noticing in how far our collective understanding of the mind has come, even while acknowledging honestly how very far it still had to go from where it stood in 1880. Let us walk, instead, into a small-town general store for a while, because this particular space deserves its own moment of attention, standing as it did at the genuine center of ordinary commercial and social life for countless small communities across the entire country. The general store carried, in a single relatively modest space, an inventory that would strike a modern shopper as almost bewilderingly varied: dry goods and fabric by the yard, tools and hardware, patent medicines and simple foodstuffs not readily produced at home, sugar and coffee and spices, along with penny candy displayed in glass jars along the counter that represented, for the children of the community, one of the genuine small delights of an otherwise fairly austere daily existence. The storekeeper himself occupied a position of real social significance within a small community, since he extended credit, in many cases, to nearly every family in the surrounding area. A ledger of running accounts, settled not with cash on the spot, but gradually, often once or twice a year, when a farm family's crop finally sold and actual money, as opposed to the eggs or butter or garden produce many families bartered directly for store goods throughout the rest of the year, briefly passed through their hands. This meant the storekeeper knew, in genuinely intimate financial detail, the fortunes and struggles of nearly every family in the community, a position of trust and, occasionally, real power, since a storekeeper unwilling to extend further credit to a family fallen on hard times could represent a genuinely serious blow to that family's ability to simply get through a difficult season. This same store, beyond its purely commercial function, served as one of the primary informal gathering spaces for a small community, particularly for men who might linger around a stove or a checkerboard set up near the counter, discussing crop prices, local politics, and whatever news had most recently arrived by rail or by mail, in conversations that could stretch on for a genuinely significant portion of an afternoon, particularly during the slower agricultural months when there was simply less urgent labor demanding immediate attention elsewhere. There is a particular set of taboos surrounding women's bodies in this era that genuinely deserves honest mention, because the silence surrounding them shaped an enormous amount of ordinary female experience in ways that rarely made it into the historical record at all, precisely because they were so rarely spoken of even at the time. Menstruation was almost never discussed openly, even between mother and daughter in many households, a young girl often receiving only the barest, most euphemistic explanation when her first period arrived, sometimes genuinely frightened by the experience if her mother's own discomfort with the subject had left her insufficiently prepared. Sanitary protection, in the absence of anything resembling modern disposable products, consisted of cloth rags, washed and reused, a practice so directly tied to the experience that the phrase on the rag persisted as a euphemism for menstruation well into the following century. And managing this monthly reality, while also managing the heavy labor and long skirts of ordinary daily life, represented a genuine, largely unspoken physical challenge that women simply absorbed into their routine without ever discussing it, even among close friends. In the overwhelming majority of documented cases, pregnancy itself, once visibly advanced, often prompted a woman to withdraw somewhat from public social life, not necessarily out of any explicit rule, though some communities and social classes did hold more rigid expectations than others, but out of a genuine cultural discomfort with visibly pregnant bodies in public, formal settings, a modesty that meant a woman's own pregnancy, one of the most significant physical experiences of her entire life, was often managed with remarkably little open discussion or community support beyond the immediate circle of female relatives and neighbors, who had in most cases already been through the exact same experience themselves and could offer practical if largely unspoken solidarity. Let me tell you something about morning photography now, because this is a detail that never fails to genuinely startle people the first time they learn of it, and it connects directly back to the very real, ever-present shadow of death and infant mortality we discussed earlier in our evening together. Given how expensive and rare formal photography remained through much of this era, a family portrait representing a genuine, considered expense rather than a casual, everyday occurrence, many families possessed no photograph at all of a child who died in infancy, having never had occasion or funds to sit for a portrait during the child's brief life. Photographers, responding to this genuine grief, offered a service that strikes modern sensibilities as genuinely unsettling, but that made a real kind of emotional sense within the context of the era, photographing the deceased child, sometimes posed as though merely sleeping, sometimes even propped gently to appear as though still among the living family members gathered for the portrait, so that the grieving parents would have some tangible, lasting image of a child who had passed too quickly through the world to have left one behind by any other means. I do not share this to be macabre for its own sake, but because I think it genuinely illuminates something true about how differently this era related to death, grief, and the desperate human need to hold on to some physical trace of a person who is gone, a need that has not changed at all across the intervening century and a half. Even as the specific ways we address it have shifted enormously, let us lighten the mood a little now and talk about something considerably more entertaining, the travelling entertainments that periodically broke up the ordinary rhythm of rural and small-town life in this decade. The circus, when it came through a region, represented a genuinely enormous event. Wagons and, increasingly through this period, entire circus trains arriving with animals that most rural Americans, particularly children, had never seen in person in their entire lives, elephants and lions and other exotic creatures that existed otherwise only as illustrations in books or magazines. The circus parade through the center of town on the morning of a performance drew crowds that could represent a genuinely significant portion of the entire local population, and the day of a circus visit was, for many rural children, remembered decades later as among the single most exciting days of their entire childhood. The traveling medicine show occupied a somewhat different, considerably more dubious niche in this same broad category of rural entertainment, a wagon arriving in town with a showman who combined genuine entertainment, music, comedy routines, sometimes a small demonstration of unusual skill or novelty, with an extended pitch for whatever tonic or elixir he was actually there to sell, promising cures for everything from rheumatism to what was vaguely termed female weakness, the product itself frequently amounting to little more than colored water, alcohol, and whatever other ingredients, sometimes genuinely dangerous ones, as we discussed earlier regarding patent medicines more broadly, the showman had settled on for that particular batch. These shows moved on quickly, often before any dissatisfied customers had fully realized how little the promised tonic had actually accomplished. A pattern of transient, occasionally outright fraudulent commerce that regulators of the era were only very slowly beginning to address through the earliest stirrings of what would eventually become genuine food and drug regulation, though real, meaningful federal oversight remained more than 2 decades away still. Law and order in most small rural communities of this decade operated on a considerably more informal basis than a modern reader might expect. A single sheriff or town constable responsible for an area that might span an entire county, meaning that day-to-day social order depended enormously on community norms, reputation, and a kind of collective informal accountability, rather than on any regular, visible law enforcement presence. Serious crime, when it did occur, could become a genuinely significant community event, drawing crowds to whatever trial eventually followed, and the local newspaper's coverage of a notable court case represented some of the most eagerly consumed content it published all year, ordinary readers following the proceedings with the same rapt attention a modern audience might give to a particularly dramatic television series. Let us talk for a while about illness more broadly, beyond what we have already covered regarding toothaches and folk remedies, because disease shaped ordinary daily life in this decade in ways that went well beyond the individual household crises we have already discussed. Typhoid fever, spread primarily through contaminated water and food, remained a genuine and serious threat throughout this entire era, particularly in communities where the water supply and waste disposal existed in uncomfortably close proximity. A well dug too near an outhouse representing a real and often unrecognized danger that claimed lives with a regularity that would be considered a genuine public health emergency by modern standards, but that ordinary 19th century Americans simply absorbed as one among many recurring, seasonal dangers of daily life. Malaria, too, remained genuinely common across much of the South and the Mississippi River Valley, spread by mosquitoes whose actual role in transmission would not be scientifically confirmed for another 2 decades, meaning that ordinary families in affected regions simply expected periodic bouts of what they called the ague, a recurring fever and chills, as a normal, if thoroughly unpleasant feature of life in low-lying, swampy areas, treated primarily with quinine where it was available and affordable. Summer, across nearly the entire country, brought its own predictable spike in illness, particularly among infants and young children, tied directly to the spoilage of milk and food in the heat that we touched on earlier, and late summer diarrheal illness claimed enough young lives each year that it represented, statistically, one of the single largest categories of childhood death throughout this entire decade, a genuinely sobering fact that shaped the anxious watchfulness with which mothers approached the hottest months of the year, checking milk for any hint of souring, keeping food covered, and, where any ice was available at all, stored as cool as circumstances allowed. Diphtheria and scarlet fever, both highly contagious and genuinely dangerous, particularly to children, could sweep through a school or a small community with frightening speed, and a household with a confirmed case was typically placed under quarantine, a sign posted on the door warning visitors away, the family effectively isolated from the rest of the community for the duration of the illness, a practice that, while genuinely medically sound even by modern understanding, also carried real social and economic cost for a family that might depend on daily contact and mutual aid from neighbors to manage their farm or household labor. I mention all of this not to leave you feeling anxious, but because I think it is worth understanding, honestly, just how much of ordinary daily awareness in this era was quietly, constantly oriented around illness and its real, ever-present possibility, a background hum of vigilance that shaped decisions large and small in a way that a modern reader, living inside a world of vaccines and antibiotics, can find genuinely difficult to fully internalize. Let us turn now to religion in a somewhat different light than we did earlier, because beyond the steady weekly rhythm of ordinary church attendance, this decade also saw genuine periods of intense, sweeping religious revival, particularly across rural and small-town America, that represented some of the most emotionally significant events an ordinary community might experience across an entire year. A traveling revival preacher arriving in a region and setting up what was often literally a large canvas tent for the occasion might draw crowds from many miles around for a series of evening meetings that could stretch across an entire week or more. Sermons delivered with an intensity and emotional fervor considerably beyond what a regular Sunday service typically offered, aimed explicitly at prompting genuine, dramatic conversion experiences among attendees. These revival meetings carried real social as well as spiritual significance, drawing together an entire scattered rural community in a shared, intense emotional experience that could, in a genuine and lasting way, reshape a person's entire sense of purpose and moral direction. A young man known for drinking and general roughness, sometimes emerging from a week of revival meetings genuinely, visibly transformed, a change the entire watching community would note, and in many cases hold him to for years afterward. For black communities, particularly across the South, the church held an even more central and layered role than it did for most white communities of the same era, serving simultaneously as a spiritual home, a genuine center of mutual aid and community organization, and very often the single institution most fully controlled and led by black Americans themselves in a broader society that denied them control and leadership almost everywhere else. Black churches of this era organized burial societies, providing the community's poorest families with dignified funerals they could never otherwise have afforded, ran informal schools in the years before public education was reliably extended to black children in many southern communities, and served as the genuine organizational backbone of a community actively building institutions of self-reliance in the face of a society still actively working, through both law and custom, to constrain and limit them at nearly every turn. Animals, beyond the working horses and farm livestock we have already discussed, occupied a somewhat different role in ordinary household life than the modern concept of a pet fully captures. Dogs on a farm were typically working animals first, herding livestock or guarding property, though genuine affection between a family and a longtime farm dog was certainly real and commonly documented in diaries and letters. A dog's death sometimes mourned with real, unself-conscious grief even within households that would never have described the animal in the sentimental language a modern pet owner might use. Cats were valued primarily and quite practically for their usefulness in controlling the rodent population that would otherwise threaten stored grain and food supplies, though again, genuine fondness for a particular household cat shows up regularly enough in the surviving record that we should not assume 19th century Americans related to their animals in a purely transactional way, even when the animal's original purpose had been entirely practical. Let us talk for a moment about politics and power, because the 1880s sat at a genuinely significant moment in the ongoing American argument over who actually got a meaningful say in how the country was run, and this touched ordinary daily life more directly than people sometimes assume. Women across the entire country could not vote in this decade, with the notable exception of a small handful of Western territories, Wyoming most prominently, which had extended suffrage to women as early as 1869, a genuinely remarkable and largely pragmatic decision at the time, driven at least partly by a territorial government hoping to attract more women settlers to a heavily male frontier population, though the effect, whatever the original motivation, was real and lasting. For the overwhelming majority of American women, however, political participation in this decade meant influence exercised entirely outside the formal machinery of voting and office holding, through the church, through temperance organizations, through the kind of informal community pressure and reputation we have already discussed at length, and increasingly through organized suffrage advocacy that was gaining real, if still gradual, momentum across this exact period. Meetings and petitions and public speaking engagements undertaken by women who understood, correctly as it would turn out, that the argument for their own political voice would take patient, sustained decades of work before it finally succeeded. The temperance movement deserves particular mention here, because it represented one of the primary avenues through which ordinary American women, denied a formal political voice, nonetheless exercised real, organized public influence in this decade. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in the previous decade and reaching genuinely significant national membership by the 1880s, argued that alcohol consumption, overwhelmingly by men, represented a direct and serious threat to the safety and economic stability of women and children, a husband's drinking capable of consuming a family's already limited income, and in the more severe cases that temperance literature of the era documented with real, sometimes harrowing detail, leading to genuine domestic violence that a wife of this era had remarkably few legal protections against. Temperance activism gave ordinary women a genuinely respectable, church-sanctioned avenue into public speaking and organizing, skills and networks that would prove directly useful to the broader suffrage movement in the decades that followed, since many of the same women moved between both causes over the course of their activist lives. Labor organizing, meanwhile, was reaching a genuinely significant peak through exactly this decade, particularly among the industrial and urban working class we discussed earlier through Anna's factory experience. The Knights of Labor, a broad and genuinely unusual labor organization for its time, in that it welcomed both skilled and unskilled workers, men and women, and, notably for the era, black and white workers into the same organization, grew explosively through the early 1880s, reaching a membership of several 100,000 by the middle of the decade, before a series of setbacks, including public backlash following the Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886, a labor rally that ended in a bombing and violent police response whose exact circumstances remain debated even today, significantly damaged the organization's public standing and eventual influence. For an ordinary factory worker like Anna, union membership, where it existed at all in her particular workplace, represented one of the very few tools available for pushing back against wages and working conditions that, as we discussed, left remarkably little margin for genuine security. A strike, when workers in a particular factory or industry did organize one, carried real and serious risk, since striking workers had no guaranteed right to their jobs, and factory owners could and frequently did simply replace them with new workers drawn from the seemingly endless pool of people desperate enough for any wage at all to cross a picket line, a reality that made sustained, successful labor organizing in this era a genuinely difficult, often heartbreaking undertaking, punctuated by real victories, but also by real, sometimes violent defeats. I raise all of this because I think it is worth understanding that ordinary people in this decade were not simply passive figures moving through a fixed set of daily routines, however much our evening together has understandably focused on exactly those routines. They were, in their own ways, large and small, actively pushing against the constraints of the world they had been born into, women organizing temperance meetings and suffrage petitions in the same afternoons they otherwise spent canning tomatoes and mending shirts, factory workers weighing the genuine risk of losing their only income against the possibility of winning even a slightly less punishing work week. The ordinary and the political were never, in truth, fully separate categories in these people's actual lived experience, however neatly we might be tempted to file them into separate chapters when we tell the story looking backward. Let me give you a few more of the details that I think genuinely qualify as shocking, the kind of thing that stops people cold when they first learn of it, because I promised you at the start of this evening that some of what we covered tonight would surprise you, and I have a handful of pieces left that I have been saving. Teething powders, given to infants across this entire decade, to ease the genuine discomfort of new teeth pushing through tender gums, quite commonly contained mercury, specifically calomel, a compound we now understand to be seriously toxic, capable of causing a condition called pink disease in affected infants, involving swelling, skin peeling, and genuine neurological damage in severe cases, none of which was understood or connected to the powder itself at the time, since the symptoms when they appeared were simply attributed to some other unrelated childhood ailment. Parents administering these powders were doing so in complete good faith, following the explicit recommendation of doctors and the confident claims printed directly on the packaging, a genuinely unsettling reminder of how much trust ordinary families placed in a medical and pharmaceutical establishment that did not yet have anything resembling the regulatory oversight we now take for granted. Arsenic, remarkably, showed up in an entire range of ordinary household products beyond the complexion wafers we mentioned earlier, including, quite commonly, the dye used in wallpaper, a particular vivid green shade known as Sheila's green or Paris green, proving especially popular through this era precisely because of how vibrant and fashionable it appeared, entirely unaware that the arsenic compound giving it that color could, under damp conditions that encouraged the growth of certain molds, release genuinely toxic arsenic gas directly into a room's air, a phenomenon some medical historians now believe may have quietly sickened or even killed occupants of homes decorated with this particular wallpaper, their symptoms attributed at the time to any number of other, unrelated causes. Female hysteria deserves specific mention here as well, because it represents one of the genuinely stranger corners of 19th century medicine, a diagnosis applied to an enormously broad and vague range of symptoms in women: anxiety, irritability, fatigue, a general sense of nervous discontent that, viewed with modern understanding, likely encompassed everything from legitimate depression and anxiety to the entirely reasonable frustration of women living within a society that offered them remarkably little genuine autonomy or outlet for their own ambitions and frustrations. Treatment for hysteria varied considerably, from the relatively benign rest, fresh air, a change of scenery, to the genuinely bizarre, including pelvic massage performed by a physician specifically intended to induce what the medical literature of the era described in careful clinical euphemism, a treatment that, understood plainly through modern eyes, amounted to medically administered stimulation that doctors of the time genuinely did not connect to its obvious sexual character, at least not in any way they were willing to acknowledge in professional writing. The rest cure, developed and popularized by an American physician during roughly this exact period, represented another approach to treating women diagnosed with nervous complaints, prescribing weeks or even months of near-total bed rest, isolation from all mental stimulation including reading and writing, and a rich, fattening diet, a treatment that the writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman would famously and devastatingly critique just a few years later in her short story The Yellow Wallpaper, drawing directly on her own genuinely damaging experience undergoing exactly this treatment. The story standing today as one of the era's most pointed pieces of evidence for just how thoroughly ordinary women's genuine psychological distress could be misdiagnosed and actively worsened by a medical establishment that had very little real interest in understanding what these women were actually experiencing or why. I share these details with you not to leave you feeling unsettled right before we ease toward rest ourselves, but because I think there is something genuinely valuable in sitting, just for a moment, with how much confident, well-intentioned harm could move through a society that had not yet developed the tools to recognize it as harm at all. It is, I think, a useful thing to remember, a gentle reminder that our own era, for all its confidence, likely carries its own version of teething powder and Paris green wallpaper, things we currently do in complete good faith that a future audience, sitting somewhere warm and safe 140 years from now, might find equally difficult to understand. Let us go back to Margaret now, and to Thomas, and to that Ohio farmhouse we began our evening inside, because the day we started with all those hours ago has been moving forward this entire time underneath everything else we have discussed, and it is worth returning to before we finally let it, and ourselves, come to rest. It is late afternoon now, the light outside beginning to take on that particular slanting gold quality it gets in the hour or two before real evening sets in, and Margaret is back in the kitchen, this time preparing supper rather than breakfast, a meal that, unlike the heavy, fuel-focused breakfast we discussed earlier, tended in most farm households towards something a little lighter, since the heaviest labor of the day was largely done by this point, and the body's needs shifted accordingly. Perhaps there is cornbread left from the noon meal, split and fried in a little leftover bacon fat until the edges crisp. Perhaps there are the greens she gathered from the garden that morning, wilted down with a little vinegar and the same rendered fat that flavored nearly everything cooked in this kitchen. Perhaps, if a hen had stopped laying and outlived her usefulness, there is chicken, stewed slowly through the afternoon in a pot that has been simmering on the back of the stove since well before noon, filling the whole house with a smell that reaches all the way out to wherever Thomas and the older children are still finishing the day's outdoor work. The children drift in one by one as the light fades, each of them carrying the particular, specific tiredness of a body that has genuinely worked all day. Not the diffuse mental fatigue a modern child might describe after a day of school and screens, but a real, physical exhaustion in the legs and the arms and the lower back that settles differently into a young body, and that, honestly, most of these children would likely describe, if you could ask them, as simply normal, unremarkable, the way any child considers whatever shape their particular life happens to take as simply the shape life takes. Thomas comes in last, after the evening milking is finally done, and there is a specific, small ritual to this moment that shows up again and again in the diaries and letters of the era. A husband washing up at the same basin his wife has used all day, water that has likely been reheated once or twice already, hands and face and forearms scrubbed clean of the day's dirt before he sits down at the table, a small transitional gesture between the working day and the family evening that most households of this era observed with real consistency, whatever their particular regional or economic circumstances happen to be. Supper itself, eaten together around the same table where breakfast had happened in the dark so many hours earlier, was one of the few moments in an ordinary 19th century day when the entire family was reliably gathered in one place at one time, and conversation at this table, however brief and however plain the actual words exchanged, represented a genuine point of connection in days that otherwise scattered each family member toward their own separate labor from sun-up onward. Thomas might mention how a particular field was coming along, or a piece of news heard from a neighbor met at the fence line. Margaret might mention that the hens had finally started laying properly again after weeks of the seasonal slowdown, a small piece of household news that nonetheless mattered genuinely to a family's daily provisioning. The children, if the household's particular character allowed for it, might be permitted to speak of their own day, a story from school if this was a school day, a small drama involving a sibling or a barnyard animal that seemed, from the height of a child's own experience, genuinely significant. After supper, the work was not yet entirely finished, though its character shifted into something a little gentler than the day's main labor had been. Dishes needed washing, in water heated yet again on a stove that had by this point been burning for the better part of 16 hours straight. The younger children might be set to some small, manageable evening task, shelling dried beans into a bowl, perhaps, a task simple enough for small hands and quiet enough to be done while sitting, a welcome change after a day spent mostly on their feet. Thomas might step back outside briefly to check that the barn was properly secured for the night, animals settled, doors latched against whatever predator might otherwise take advantage of an unlocked henhouse under cover of darkness, and then, gradually, as the last of the daylight actually failed and the kerosene lamp was lit in the kitchen, casting its familiar, limited circle of warm light across the table where the family had eaten only an hour or so before, the household settled into whatever version of evening leisure it had developed as its own particular habit. Perhaps Margaret took up mending by the lamp, a basket of socks and shirts that had accumulated small tears and worn patches over the preceding week, her needle moving with the kind of practiced, almost unconscious skill that comes only from years of repetition, her eyes barely needing to track the stitches directly anymore. Perhaps Thomas read aloud from whatever newspaper had most recently arrived, or from the family Bible, a chapter or two most evenings in many households, a habit rooted as much in genuine religious devotion as in the simple fact that it represented one of the only pieces of substantial reading material most rural households reliably owned. The younger children were put to bed early in most households of this era, not out of any particular strictness for its own sake, but out of plain practical necessity, since the whole family rhythm depended on everyone rising again before dawn, and a child allowed to stay up too late tonight would simply be a genuinely difficult, overtired child to manage tomorrow morning when there was real work to be done. Bedtime itself, for a small child, involved a version of the same washing up ritual we have already described, a quick basin wash of face and hands and feet, particularly feet, since children spent an enormous amount of their day barefoot in warmer months, the specific freedom and specific dirt of a 19th century farm child's bare feet being one of the small, genuine pleasures of rural childhood in this era, remembered fondly by countless adults decades later, even amid all the labor and hardship we have otherwise discussed tonight. A bedtime story or prayer in households that observed either custom, tended toward brevity rather than the elaborate extended rituals a modern parent might associate with the phrase, a short prayer recited by rote, perhaps a single verse of a hymn sung softly, and then the child tucked beneath quilts that had, in many cases, been pieced together by the very same mother now tucking them in, patches of fabric that had once been a worn-out dress or a father's outgrown shirt, now repurposed into warmth for a small sleeping body. There is something in that particular continuity that I find myself genuinely moved by, a garment's entire useful life extending from a grown woman's Sunday dress through years of daily wear, then reborn as a quilt patch, still doing quiet, useful work for the family that made it long after its original purpose had been worn entirely away. For the older children, bedtime came a little later, permitted to sit up with the adults for a while longer, perhaps helping with whatever evening task was underway, perhaps simply listening quietly to the adult conversation happening around them, absorbing, the way children in every era absorb, far more of the adult world than the adults themselves often realize, learning through simple proximity and repetition the particular rhythms and values and quiet worries of the household they were being raised inside. By the time the entire household had finally gone still, the kerosene lamp extinguished and carried carefully up the stairs to light the final walk to bed, the farmhouse settled into a genuine, particular kind of quiet that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is a quiet that has almost entirely vanished from modern experience. No electric hum of a refrigerator cycling on and off somewhere in the house, no distant traffic, no glow of a streetlight seeping in around a curtain, just the house itself, settling and creaking gently as the temperature dropped through the evening, the occasional soft lowing of a cow from the barn, the wind moving through whatever trees stood near enough to the house to be heard, and beyond that, an enormous, genuinely profound darkness and silence stretching out across the fields in every direction, broken only by the distant occasional call of an owl or the yip of a coyote somewhere well beyond the edge of the cultivated land. I think about this specific quality of silence often, honestly, because I think it shaped something in the 19th century mind that is genuinely difficult for us to access now, from inside a world that is almost never actually fully quiet, even at its most peaceful. A person going to sleep in that farmhouse was going to sleep inside something close to true darkness and true silence, night after night, year after year, an experience that must have shaped sleep itself differently than it does for us now, accustomed as most of us are to some degree of ambient light and ambient sound even in our own bedrooms. Margaret and Thomas, in whatever version of quiet, private conversation a long-married couple falls into once the children are finally genuinely asleep, might speak softly of tomorrow's plans, or of the small worry Margaret had been carrying all day, the pregnancy she still had not spoken of even to her own husband, though perhaps, in the particular safety and closeness of this specific quiet hour, tonight is finally the night she finds the words for it, her voice pitched low in the darkness, Thomas going still beside her the way a man does when he understands, immediately and completely, that what he is about to hear will matter more than almost anything else that has happened all year. We cannot know, of course, exactly what was said in any one particular farmhouse on any one particular night 140 years ago, but we know, from the letters and diaries that do survive, that conversations exactly like this one happened constantly, quietly, in the dark, in kitchens and bedrooms across the entire country, ordinary people finding, in the last private hour of an exhausting day, the words for the things that mattered most to them. Let us drift for a few final minutes away from that Ohio farmhouse, because Margaret and Thomas were only ever one household among millions, and I think it is worth letting your mind wander briefly across the wider country before we finally settle all the way into rest ourselves. In that New York tenement we visited earlier, Anna's evening looked considerably different, shaped by an entirely different set of walls and sounds. Her factory shift ended at 6, later in busier seasons, and the walk home through crowded streets, gas lamps just beginning to be lit along the busier avenues, though her own narrower side street relied mostly on whatever light spilled from windows and doorways, brought her back to rooms shared with her parents and 3 younger siblings, the particular, constant noise of a building housing dozens of families layered on top of each other, someone's baby crying 2 floors up, a fight or a laugh carrying clearly through walls thin enough to make genuine privacy an almost entirely foreign concept. Supper here might be simpler than Margaret's. Bread and whatever cheap cut of meat or vegetable had been affordable that particular week, eaten quickly at a small table that also served, later in the evening, as the surface where Anna's mother did piecework by lamplight, sewing buttonholes for a few extra cents a garment, hands moving fast in the dim light while conversation continued around her in a mixture of English and whatever language the family had carried with them from wherever they had come from. Anna's evening leisure, such as it was, might mean a walk with a young man she had begun seeing, chaperoned loosely by a younger sibling sent along in a gesture toward propriety that satisfied the letter of respectability without much genuinely restricting the couple's actual conversation, or an evening spent with other young women from her building, sitting on the front stoop in warmer months, the stoop itself functioning as a kind of communal outdoor parlor for buildings that offered their residents remarkably little private outdoor space of their own, gossip and songs from the old country, and genuine hard-won laughter carrying up and down the block, until it was finally, reluctantly, time to go back inside for the night. Further south, in that sharecropper's cabin we mentioned earlier, evening brought its own particular rhythm. A family gathered around a fire in a cabin considerably more modest than either the Ohio farmhouse or the New York tenement. Supper often built around cornbread and whatever vegetables the family's own small garden plot, permitted alongside the cotton they grew for the landowner, had managed to produce that season. Music here carried a particular, genuine richness, spirituals and work songs passed down through generations, sung softly in the evening, not merely as entertainment, but as a genuine, sustaining expression of faith and endurance and hope that had carried a whole people through slavery and now carried them through this new, still deeply unequal chapter. Voices rising together in the firelight in harmonies that would, in the coming decades, fundamentally reshape American music itself, though the family singing together in that particular cabin on that particular night had no way of knowing the full reach their tradition would eventually have. Out on the plains, in a soddy lit by a single precious lamp, that isolated homesteading family might sit in a silence even more complete than Margaret and Thomas experienced. The nearest neighbour genuinely miles distant, the wind outside the thick sod walls, the only sound for a stretch that could feel, on the hardest nights, almost overwhelming in its emptiness. And yet, inside that small dark room, a family still gathered close around whatever light and warmth they had managed to create for themselves. Children read to from whatever few books had made the journey west with them, a mother's hand resting on a husband's shoulder in a gesture that needed no accompanying words at all, and far out on a reservation in the same decade, under an entirely different and considerably harder set of circumstances than any of the households we have just described. Families still gathered in whatever way circumstances allowed, still told the stories that connected children to grandparents, and grandparents to a history stretching back long before any European ship had ever reached this continent's shore. A quiet, determined continuity maintained against genuinely enormous pressure, a fire that policy and violence had tried very hard to extinguish, and had remarkably not managed to put out. All across this vast, varied country, on this one ordinary night in the 1880s, millions of people were doing some version of exactly this, finishing a day's labor, gathering whatever family or community they had close around them, finding warmth and light and a small measure of rest before beginning the entire cycle again the following morning. Different languages, different foods, different degrees of hardship and different degrees of comfort. And yet, underneath all of that genuine, real difference, something recognizably, persistently the same, an ordinary human need for connection and rest, and the particular comfort of a familiar voice in the dark. There is one more piece of ordinary life I want to walk through with you before we let this evening close, because it touches something genuinely fundamental about how a woman like Margaret existed within her own marriage, legally speaking, and I think it is precisely the kind of detail that qualifies as genuinely shocking to a modern audience, however quietly it sat inside the ordinary texture of the era. Under a legal doctrine inherited from English common law, and still very much in effect across most of the United States through this entire decade, a married woman's legal identity was, in a real and formal sense, absorbed into her husband's upon marriage, a principle called coverture. In practical terms, this meant that a married woman in most states could not, on her own signature alone, own property in her own name, sign a binding contract, keep wages she earned through her own labor, or in many jurisdictions even claim legal custody of her own children in the event of a divorce or separation, since a husband was, by default, considered the children's legal guardian regardless of which parent had actually done the bulk of the raising. Some states had begun passing married women's property acts in the decades leading up to this one, gradually chipping away at the harshest edges of coverture, but the pace and thoroughness of these reforms varied enormously from state to state, meaning a married woman's actual legal standing could look genuinely different depending simply on which side of a state line her particular farmhouse happened to sit. What this meant for Margaret in practice day to day was perhaps less dramatic than the legal language itself suggests, since most ordinary marriages of this era functioned through genuine, if unequal, partnership, rather than through a husband constantly, explicitly asserting the full weight of his legal authority over every small household decision. But the underlying legal reality remained, a quiet, structural fact sitting beneath the entire visible architecture of daily life, and it surfaced with real and sometimes devastating consequence precisely in the moments when a marriage went wrong. An abusive husband, a husband who drank away the family's income, a husband who simply abandoned his family outright, situations in which a wife of this era found herself with remarkably few independent legal tools to protect herself or her children, dependent almost entirely on the mercy of local custom, extended family, or a legal system that was, by explicit design, not built to center her interests as separate and equal to her husband's own. I raise this not to cast a shadow back over everything warm we have discussed tonight, the genuine partnership and tenderness that so clearly did exist within countless ordinary 19th century marriages, but because I think an honest account of the era has to hold both truths at once, real, lived affection existing simultaneously alongside a legal structure that offered a married woman remarkably little independent standing of her own, a tension that the women of this decade carried every single day, mostly in silence, and that the coming suffrage and property rights movements we touched on earlier were working, patiently and persistently, to eventually dismantle. Let us turn to something considerably lighter now, because I do not want to leave you with only the heavy details before we finally rest, and children's play deserves genuine attention of its own, since even inside lives built so heavily around labor, childhood in the 1880s still carried real joy and real recognizable play, however different its specific forms might look from what a modern child would recognize. Homemade toys dominated most ordinary childhoods, since store-bought toys, where they existed at all, remained a genuine luxury reserved mostly for wealthier families or for special occasions like the Christmas we discussed earlier. A corn husk doll, fashioned by a mother or grandmother from dried husks saved specifically for this purpose, its face sometimes left blank, sometimes lightly marked with charcoal, served countless small girls as a genuinely beloved companion, mended and redressed as it wore out over years of play. Boys favored marbles, sometimes genuinely purchased if a family could spare the few pennies, sometimes improvised from small, carefully rounded stones or clay balls fired hard in the same stove that cooked the family's meals, and a good game of marbles, played in the dirt yard outside a farmhouse or a one-room schoolhouse during the noon recess, carried real, serious stakes among the boys involved, reputations for skill built and maintained across an entire school year. Hoop rolling. A stick used to keep an old barrel hoop or wagon wheel rim spinning and moving forward across open ground, provided a genuinely simple but apparently endlessly satisfying form of play that shows up repeatedly across surviving childhood memoirs of the era, alongside games that required no equipment at all beyond other children and open space, tag, hide and seek, and a whole regional variety of singing games played specifically by groups of girls, hands joined in a circle, voices moving through rhymes and melodies passed down with genuine consistency from one generation of children to the next, absorbed the way children absorb these things, through pure repetition and imitation, rather than any formal teaching. Swimming, in whatever creek or pond happened to be within walking distance, represented one of the single greatest pleasures of a rural summer for children of this era. A genuine, sanctioned escape from labor and from the heat both at once, and surviving accounts of 19th century rural childhood mention it with a warmth and vividness that stands out clearly, even amid all the era's genuine hardship. An afternoon spent at the swimming hole remembered, decades later, by elderly interviewees as among the purest, simplest happiness their entire long lives had contained. Naming a child, while we are on the subject of childhood, followed its own set of genuine customs worth mentioning briefly, since a family's choice of name carried real, if largely unspoken, meaning. Children were very commonly named directly after grandparents, a practice that served the practical function of honoring and remembering the older generation while the child was still young enough for that grandparent to potentially know them, and it was genuinely common, almost expected in many families, for a couple's first son to carry his paternal grandfather's name, the first daughter her maternal grandmother's, a pattern followed with enough consistency that genealogists tracing family trees from this era can often make reasonably confident guesses about a family's naming pattern well before they have located the actual birth records to confirm it. Biblical names remained enormously popular across nearly every Protestant denomination and region, though the particular flavor of biblical name favored could vary by community. Certain more obscure Old Testament names enjoying real, if localized, popularity in some regions, specifically because a locally admired minister or respected community elder had once carried that same name. And penmanship, before we finally move toward closing, deserves one last small mention, because handwriting itself carried genuine cultural weight in this era, in a way that has almost entirely vanished from modern life. Children drilled for hours at school in the specific, elaborate loops and flourishes of the Spencerian script that dominated American penmanship instruction through this exact period. A beautiful, disciplined handwriting, considered a genuine mark of proper education and moral character both, a child's clean, well-formed letters reflecting, in the era's own logic, something meaningful about the orderliness and discipline of the mind that had produced them. There is one final piece worth walking through before we finally rest, and it concerns something that shadowed nearly every household we have discussed tonight, farm and factory alike, the genuine constant physical danger woven into ordinary 19th century labor, farm machinery, even the relatively simple mechanized equipment increasingly available by this decade, carried real and serious risk for anyone working around it. A hand or an arm caught in a thresher or a reaper capable of causing injuries that a rural doctor, working without the antiseptic surgical standards that were only just beginning to spread through American medical practice following Joseph Lister's work in the preceding decades, could do relatively little to fully repair. Amputation, when a serious enough injury occurred, was not the rare, dramatic event it would represent today, but a genuinely recurring feature of rural life, and it was not at all unusual for a farming community to include several men missing a finger, a hand or more, injuries carried for the remainder of their lives as simple, visible evidence of the ordinary hazards their labor demanded of them, discussed with a matter-of-fact plainness that a modern audience, accustomed to a considerably safer relationship with mechanized equipment, might find genuinely startling. Runaway horses represented another recurring source of serious injury and occasional death, a spooked team bolting with a wagon still attached capable of causing genuine chaos and real harm to anyone in its path, and newspapers across the country reported on these incidents with a regularity that speaks to how common they actually were. A horse startled by nothing more dramatic than a sudden noise or an unexpected movement, and a family's entire sense of security shattered in the span of a few genuinely terrifying seconds. Falls from barn lofts, kicks from mules and horses being shod or otherwise handled, the simple, cumulative wear of decades spent lifting and hauling weight that would concern any modern physical therapist considerably. All of this sat quietly within the background risk of ordinary rural labor, absorbed by families who had in truth very little choice but to absorb it, since the alternative to this dangerous labor was very often no income at all. Let us close this particular thread with a word on money itself. Since we have talked all evening about labor and household management, without quite pausing to consider what these ordinary families actually held in their pockets, so to speak, and how genuinely different the relationship between labor and cash actually was in this era compared to our own. A great deal of ordinary economic life, particularly in rural communities, ran on barter and credit rather than cash changing hands directly, a farm family trading eggs or butter or a portion of their harvest directly for goods at the general store we discussed earlier. Actual currency remaining, for many households, a genuinely scarce resource reserved for the handful of transactions that absolutely required it, taxes perhaps, or a debt to a bank, or a more distant supplier who would not accept payment in eggs. A skilled tradesman in a town, a blacksmith or a carpenter, might earn somewhere in the range of $2 for a full day's labor, a genuinely respectable wage by the standards of the era, while unskilled labor, the kind Anna's father or brothers might find in a city, paid considerably less, often closer to $1, or even less for the same length of exhausting workday. Understanding these figures requires understanding what they could actually buy: a pound of coffee running somewhere around 30 cents, a pound of sugar closer to 10, a modest home in a small town perhaps $800 to $1,000 outright, a sum that, for an ordinary wage-earning family, could represent years, sometimes an entire working lifetime, of careful, deliberate saving to eventually accumulate. This meant that the margin between comfortable and genuinely precarious, for the overwhelming majority of the families we have spent this evening with, was considerably thinner than most modern audiences, however aware they already are of 19th century hardship, tend to fully appreciate. A single bad harvest, a single serious illness requiring a doctor's genuinely expensive attention, a single farming accident that left a breadwinner unable to work for weeks or months, could tip an ordinary, reasonably stable household into real crisis with a speed that the accumulated savings and social safety nets of modern life have, thankfully, made considerably harder to fully imagine from the inside. One last small detail, and then I really will let the evening close properly. The telegraph, by this decade, had already connected most major American cities and a great many smaller towns as well, meaning that news of genuinely distant events, a presidential decision, a disaster on the far side of the country, could reach an ordinary small-town newspaper within a day, sometimes within hours, a speed of information that represented a real and recent transformation from the weeks or months such news might have taken to travel just a generation or two earlier. And yet this speed applied almost entirely to public formal news rather than to personal private communication, which still moved, for the ordinary family, at the considerably slower and more human pace of the postal letter we discussed earlier. A strange and interesting asymmetry, a farmer in Nebraska able to read about an event in Washington within a day of it happening, while a letter from his own sister 2 states away might still take the better part of a week to actually arrive in his hands. Before we let this evening fully close, I want to tell you one more thing, because it is the kind of detail that genuinely rearranges how you think about an entire decade once you actually sit with it, and it has to do with something as basic as what time it actually was. For most of the 1880s, up until November of 1883, there was no such thing as standardized time zones anywhere in the United States. Each town, each city, set its own local time based on the actual position of the sun directly overhead, meaning that noon in one town might be several minutes earlier or later than noon in a town only a short distance away. A genuine practical chaos once railroads began connecting these towns and requiring some kind of shared schedule to actually operate safely and reliably. Railroad companies themselves, out of sheer operational necessity, were the ones who eventually forced the issue, establishing 4 standard time zones across the country in 1883 specifically to make train schedules coherent, a change that many ordinary Americans initially resisted and even resented, genuinely uneasy about the idea of accepting an artificial, standardized time that might differ by several minutes from what the actual sun in their own sky was telling them. Clocks themselves, before this standardization, and to some degree even after it, remained a genuine household investment rather than an assumed universal object the way they are today. A mantel clock, wound carefully each week, its steady ticking marking time through the household's daily rhythm, represented real money, and a family without one relied instead on the position of the sun, the crowing of roosters, the factory whistle if they lived close enough to town to hear one, and a kind of deeply internalized, practiced sense of time passing that came from a life lived in genuinely close rhythm with the natural day, a skill that most modern people, glancing constantly at phones and clocks, have simply never had occasion to develop for themselves. I find this detail genuinely worth sitting with, because it captures something true about how differently this era experienced the very fabric of daily existence, time itself not yet fully standardized, fully abstracted, fully separated from the actual physical sun moving across an actual physical sky. Margaret's entire day, every task we have walked through together tonight, happened inside a relationship to time that was, in a very real sense, more honest, more directly tied to the natural world than the relationship most of us carry today, glancing at glowing screens that tell us, with perfect confidence, an hour that may have very little to do with where the sun actually happens to be sitting above our own particular patch of ground in this particular moment. And now, as we finally let this long day close, hers and countless others like it, scattered across an entire vast and varied country on one ordinary night 140 years ago, I want you to picture it one more time, all at once, all together. The kerosene lamps going dark, one household at a time, across an entire continent. The fires banked low for the night, coals glowing faintly under a careful layer of ash that will make tomorrow's fire that much easier to start. The animals settled in barns and pens, the crops standing quiet in dark fields, the rivers moving the same steady way they had moved for centuries before any of these particular households had ever existed, and would keep moving long after every person we have discussed tonight was gone. Somewhere in that darkness, Margaret has finally spoken the words she had been carrying quietly all day, and Thomas has taken her hand in the dark, and whatever fear either of them carries about what is to come sits, for now, gently alongside something that feels, in this particular quiet hour, remarkably like hope. Somewhere else, Anna has finally drifted to sleep despite the noise of the building around her, young and tired and, in her own way, genuinely hopeful about a future she cannot yet see the full shape of. Somewhere else again, a family in a cabin has banked their own small fire and settled into whatever rest the night allows them, carrying forward, quietly, stubbornly, a whole world of history and song and faith that no landowner's ledger could ever fully account for or contain. Think for just one more moment of everything that single ordinary day actually contained: water hauled and fires lit before sunrise, bread baked and animals fed, and children raised and mended and taught, a whole intricate, unglamorous machinery of care that kept an entire nation quietly running, one household at a time, without ever once asking to be called remarkable, though it was. This was ordinary life in 1880s America, and I am genuinely sincerely glad you spent this quiet, unhurried hour of it here with me tonight, friend. Not the grand halls, not the robber barons, not the polished, carefully staged version of the era that made it into the paintings and the photographs taken for people wealthy enough to afford to sit still for one. The real version. Hands roughened by washboards and plough handles, children who worked and played in the same breath, grief carried quietly alongside genuine persistent joy, neighbors who showed up without being asked, and quiet debts of kindness repaid slowly, over years, in eggs and labor and simple presence. A whole country of ordinary people, doing ordinary things, extraordinarily well, simply because there was no other way to do them at all. I hope tonight gave you a little of what you came here for, whatever that happened to be, a bit of history, a bit of company, a bit of quiet reassurance that ordinary people, in every era, have always found some way to carry each other through, a window into a world that is gone now, mostly, though pieces of it linger still, in old family recipes, in a quilt pattern passed down through generations, in the particular, practiced silence of a person who still, even now, knows how to sit quietly in the dark without reaching immediately for a light. Wherever you are tonight, whatever bed or couch or quiet corner of the world you are listening from, whether it is raining outside your window or perfectly still, I hope you feel, at least a little, some of that same settled, hard-earned rest that Margaret and Anna and all the others were finally, gratefully sinking into as their own long day came to its close. Close your eyes now, if you have not already. Let the house go quiet around you the way it went quiet around them, the lamps dimming, the world outside settling into its own late, gentle hush. You have made it through your own long day too, and that is no small thing, whatever shape that day happened to take. Sleep well, friend. I will be here again next time, whenever you are ready to come back and listen, and there will always be another quiet corner of the past waiting for us to visit together. Good night.